All right. New episode of Jung Naiv. I have a new guest. Who are you?
Steve Keen.
Steve, what do you do?
I used to joke that I couldn't wait till I retired so I could get some serious work done. Unfortunately, it's no longer funny. I'm a retired professor of economics, but I spend 7 days a week both fighting mainstream economics and trying to develop an alternative.
Why would you fight mainstream economics?
Because it's a load of garbage. It should have been thrown out 100 years ago.
What?
Yes. It's something which it's a paradigm. You know the concept of a paradigm, a manner of thinking about the world, which when it started 150 years ago, roughly in the 1870s, was a plausible alternative to the classical school of economics that it supplanted. And then there was about 50 years of work where they tried to turn it from a set of concepts into a more mathematical framework. And every last thing they tried to do mathematically failed. Okay? But they continued on as if they hadn't failed. And as if is almost an essential phrase because they do this as if logic all the way through. So the starting point of it was the work of Volra, Marshall, Volra, Jevons and Menger back in the 1870s. You know the names?
No.
You don't know the names?
Of course not.
Well, you did some economics.
Well, I pretend to not to know.
Okay. Well,
So you're going to play along.
Okay. Well, Volra was the French non-mathematical economist who tried to do mathematical economics and build a model of the Paris Stock Exchange, which called Parry Boss, which was a specialised market that I've walked past a couple of times. I've never actually been inside. I should actually go and check it out. But it's a place where there are markets for particular commodities. In each room there's people come along who are trading that particular commodity. There's an auctioneer, and the auctioneer's role is to jiggle the price until such time as the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied and that market is cleared. And Volra had the not entirely crazy idea of try to imagine the whole of capitalism as like a giant version of the Parry Boss where rather than just one commodity being traded, you've got all the commodities. Okay. And then you have the same sort of thing. An auctioneer is there, and rather than calling out a single price for a single commodity, you call out a vector of prices for all the commodities. And he imagined that what the auctioneer would do is if there was more demand than supply in an individual market, then he'd put the price up, and more supply than demand, he'd put the price down. And that, of course, if you draw that on a matrix of commodities, that particular diagonal will necessarily go towards equilibrium. But then what happens is all the various changes. If you change the market price for pears, you're going to have impact on the market price for pigs. Okay? And so he said, well, and you'll have an impact on the market for steel as well. So he said, well, let's imagine that if we look across the diagonal, all the price changes are going in the right direction. And the off-diagonal stuff, some is going to go the right way, some is going to go the wrong way. So it'll cancel itself out. And this process, what he called atonement, which means, I believe, groping, would grope its way towards the equilibrium price. And once then all markets are in equilibrium, then you'd allow trade to start. And he approached the world's leading mathematician at the time, another Frenchman, Henri Poincaré, and asked Poincaré to verify that his intuition would actually work out mathematically. And Poincaré refused.
Why?
Because he's a mathematician, okay? And he took about 20 years after that, maybe I think about 40 years after that exchange, before a pair of mathematicians sat down to solve the actual mathematical problem that's involved here. And that actually concerns, it's a theorem in pure mathematics called the Perron-Frobenius theorem. And what it proved is that if that process is going to converge, then what's called the dominant eigenvalue, okay, which mathematicians use to these terms, wouldn't have to be negative. Okay? And they proved that this is just a pure mathematics. They had no idea that that this had any relevance to economics whatsoever. But they proved the dominant value is positive, which means it's unstable, which means the process would never converge, which means that if you're waiting for all the markets to be in equilibrium in this hypothetical Paris Bourse, you'd all starve to death because you'd never reach equilibrium. Now, rather than saying, oh, that means prices must be disequilibrium prices, which would be the intelligent response to that particular dilemma, said, let's assume, let's imagine, et cetera, et cetera. And this has happened numerous times in the history of economics. So there are many, many issues where there was what in a philosophy of sense term is an anomaly for a paradigm. And if you know the work of Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions.
Of course not.
You're going to play the flat. You'd make a great cricketer. Very flat bat. Okay. Kuhn argued that sciences develop what he called a paradigm, which is a set of explanations that have a unifying impact upon that particular discipline. And what will happen is that a paradigm will be able to cope with reality up to a certain point, and then what people developing the paradigm try to do is extend it further and further and further. And because the paradigm will never be a perfect description of reality, anomalies will start to arise. And the normal way that the paradigm responds is to try to solve the anomalies within the paradigm, but ultimately it can't. And someone comes along with an alternative explanation, we get a new paradigm, and that's a scientific revolution occurs. So the one that Kuhn was researching when he wrote that book was the revolution from the Ptolemaic vision of the universe as the Earth being the centre of the universe and all the planets and moons and stars orbiting the Earth on perfectly concentric circular spheres. And what they couldn't explain, a number of things they couldn't explain, but the anomalies amounting up for that. And then along comes Copernicus with the argument the sun is the centre of the solar system, and we are a planet orbiting the sun, et cetera, and there's a revolution, a complete change in paradigm. So that happens when a paradigm is flawed. Okay, the Ptolemaic paradigm of the Earth being the centre of the universe could fit the data if you put circles on circles on circles, but are called epicycles. And you do that enough, you could actually fit the patterns that the planets followed around the sun.
Perfect.
On the assumption that they were going around the Earth. So you got models which could very accurately predict where the planets were going to be based on a completely false model of the structure of the solar system. Now, I'm arguing that neoclassical economics is in the same situation. It should not be taught.
But most leading economists in Europe, in the Western Hemisphere at least, they disagree. They are neoclassic economists, and they are scientists.
No, they're not.
Steve, they're scientists. Why?
Well, they are. They're scientists in the same sense as Kuhn described as science, which is they have a paradigm. And you try to explain everything working from the paradigm, the idea of markets reaching equilibrium, supply and demand, the arguments they have about money. They have a framework through which they try to understand reality. Now, and the typical thing is science, when they have an anomaly, something they can't explain, they'll attempt to cope with it within the paradigm. Okay? So yes, in that sense, they're scientists. But the extent to which they deny the anomalies themselves and refuse to reconsider them, and the fact that they select students out of their student body to reproduce them who've got the same beliefs they do. We should have had a revolution in economics 100 years ago. We haven't had it. So in that sense, I think it's pre-scientific. They might be scientists themselves practicing their paradigm, but the paradigm itself is pre-scientific.
So we're going to talk about the entire neoclassical problem that you that you criticize. But let's start in the beginning. Is economics is that a science at all?
No.
Why?
Because
it's taught at university and all this, so
it's studied
it
at
must
university.
be a science, I guess.
That's one reason why it gets away with a lot of what it does. Because people think it's taught at a university. There
are professors for it.
That's right. I've got one myself. You come out, you have the professional accreditation. You're treated as being equivalent to other disciplines.
Exactly.
Okay? And I'm arguing fundamentally they're not. My favourite example, which is when I write the third edition of Debunking Economics, this will be the opening chapter, and that's their theory of supply. Now you know about supply and demand curves. You're not going to give
Sure.
Okay. The idea of the cost of supply rises as output rises. Okay? That's based on the idea of what they call diminishing marginal productivity. Okay? And they say there that you have an ideal ratio of variable inputs, labour, to fixed inputs, capital. Competition and pressures of demand mean that you produce past that point. So as you add additional workers to the same number of fixed machines, you get diminishing output per worker, even though the workers are assumed to be of the same individual productivity. So the rising ratio of variable inputs to fixed inputs means that the cost producing each industrial unit rises. You have rising marginal costs, and that explains the supply curve. Now, when economists have gone and done surveys and asked firms what are their cost structures, 100% of the surveys have returned that at least 85% and more likely 95% or more of products are produced under conditions of constant or falling marginal cost.
Oh.
Okay. Every last survey, there's been about 70 of them since the 1930s. Every last one, the conclusion has come back that firms do not face diminishing marginal productivity. They don't have rising marginal costs.
So the more product they make, the cheaper it gets for them.
Yeah, and the reason is, when you read the explanations that the survey people give to the economists about why this is the result, they say that factories are designed by engineers to reach maximum productivity at full capacity. Okay. Now, when you build a factory, you'd be a fool to build a factory which was used at 100% capacity on day one. Okay. You build it with spare capacity to allow for growth. You have spare capacity to allow for your competitors stuffing up so you can take advantage of their market share, but you've got to be able to expand your production quite rapidly. So in those situations, the variable cost per unit are either constant or falling, and the fixed costs are a rectangular hyperbola. Okay, you're dividing a fixed cost per year by an increasing number of units, so that cost necessarily falls. Your variable cost per unit is the constant or falling. Okay. You cannot get the situation of intersecting supply and demand curves out of that. Now, that's been found, as I said, 70 times. What do the textbooks teach? The same old nonsense about diminishing marginal productivity. They will not reform themselves.
Why?
Because if they admit that real-world situation, the rest of the theory falls apart. If you no longer have marginal cost equals marginal revenue, then all the elements of conventional theory fall over. And therefore, even when they find this out themselves, they refuse to teach it to their students. But that's non-scientific behaviour.
But you're still talking about the neoclassical economists. Are there other economists who could be considered scientists? Because
I think the post-Keynesian school that I'm part of
course,
is more realistic. Ecological economics, some parts of that are better, though a lot of that is also neoclassical in style. People working in complexity theory, that's more based on scientific principles. So there are scientific elements within economics, but the dominant paradigm is, I think, as scientific as phlogiston.
So if they're not scientists, what do you consider them?
Well, they're behaving as scientists when they're
Are they artists or something? Artists?
They sincerely believe what they're doing. Okay, I don't think any
sincerity can be dangerous.
Exactly. It can be very dangerous. But if you sincerely believe something and you continue reinforcing those beliefs, you can behave in what you think is a scientific manner, but you're contradicting elements of the reality you're supposed to be analysing at the same time. So their individual behaviour, I don't. There are some frauds in scientific research, definitely. They're not being frauds, but they're not entertaining elements of reality which contradict their own theory. And when they find them, they run away. Like my favourite example is Alan Blinder. And Alan Blinder was vice president of the American Economic Association, a vice chair of the Federal Reserve, so pretty high ranking. In the mid-90s, he decided to do a survey about the costs of firms as part of the dispute between what are called new Keynesian and new classical neoclassical macroeconomists. New classicals argue prices are perfectly flexible, so all unemployment is voluntary. New Keynesians say that there are rigidities, there are imperfections, and they slow down the return to equilibrium. And one of the imperfections they talk about is sticky prices. So Blinder decided to do a survey, and it was very well funded, very large survey. Interviewing, I think, 100 firms in the northeast quadrant of the American land mass, continental land mass, which I think are responsible for something like 7% of American GDP. So it's a huge survey. And part of it was asking, what are your cost structures? There was a whole lot of questions were asked of these surveys. They were face-to-face interviews by either Blinder or his PhD students of leading members of these 100 corporations. And he said, this is a quote from chapter 4, the overwhelmingly bad news, brackets, for economic theory here, is that apparently only 11% of American manufacturing output is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost. Okay? And he said it paints a picture of the real world that is drastically different to what we teach in our textbooks. That was in the late 1990s. Read his textbook today. He does not even refer to his own research.
What?
He teaches the same, pardon the French, shit the other textbooks teach of rising marginal cost. He does not refer to his own research that contradicted that theory.
I mean, like running away from reality just reminded me of like religious fundamentalists or something.
Yeah, it is in that sense, because when you realize that fact, there's two possibilities. Either you have to abandon the theoretical structure you come from,
right,
or you forget that you found out the research results. And he fundamentally does that. I think it's quite pathetic, in a sense of what the word pathos actually means. You know, deeply emotional. You feel sorry for someone in that situation. But he had no intention of finding this particular factoid out. What he was looking at is, why do firms not adjust prices rapidly? Why are they sticky? Okay. But he had to get the actual, what are your empirical situation? Right. And he and his students all expected to find rising marginal cost, et cetera, and they found the opposite. Now, when I look at his textbook, he edits the textbook which was first started by Baumol. So there's Baumol and Blinder. I think 2015 was the last version that I read. And in that, he uses the same old thing that every other textbook does. They have made up examples about fictional firms. Okay? His was Al's Garage Company. Okay? Mankiw, you know the Mankiw textbook?
No.
Okay, so it's probably one of the dominant. This is Greg Mankiw, who is economic advisor to George Bush and teaches at Harvard. And he has things like Hungry Helen's Cookie Factory and Thirsty Thelma's Lemonade Stand and all these completely fictional examples which they make up numbers that give you the results they want, but they never refer to actual empirical research. Now, why would they do that if the empirical research actually supported them?
Right.
Okay? They don't. It doesn't support them. They simply assume it's armchair thinking, and that is non-scientific. And this is the one point where I can say distinctly non-scientific behaviour. If you have a hypothesis about a physical situation in a genuine science, you go and test that hypothesis. Now, they have a hypothesis that firms face rising costs of production. Okay? They don't go and test it. They simply armchair assume it. And then that becomes a fundamental basis of the theory. Now, if you eliminate the idea of rising supply cost, okay, and you eliminate the idea that firms maximise profit by equating marginal cost to marginal revenue, then you've pulled away one of the foundations of your chair, okay, your table. It falls over. So they don't do it. Now, that is classic non-scientific behaviour.
I remember like when I started going to university, business school, like the first semester, and the professor came up to us and we're like, okay, you're all going to be scientists. In Germany, economics is called Wirtschaftswissenschaften, the science of the economy. And they were like, okay, this is like the up-to-date science and all this, and you better be well prepared. So you kind of tell me that I've been lied to, because like we've been taught the neoclassical version of all this that you were talking about. It's not even a science.
It's a failed paradigm. Okay? It's a paradigm which had a number of essential elements to it, that have all been contradicted by either empirical research or logical analysis. And then the response, what should happen in a genuine science is that we've got to shift to a new paradigm. You have some new approach, some new way of thinking about how the economy operates that takes over, which can solve those anomalies. Now, instead of responding in that sense, and it's never individual scientists who do it. There's Max Planck was German, wasn't he?
Yes.
Okay. That's one.
I know that guy.
Okay. That's your classic scientist behaviour, because he solve what's called the black-body radiation problem. But to solve it, he had ended up mathematically showing you had to have energy had to come in discrete units, quanta. Okay. Now, he said he never managed to persuade any of his fellow scientists at the time to abandon the Maxwellian idea of continuous energy and change over to quanta, not one. He said what actually the reason change occurs is that a new generation comes through which is comfortable with the new concept, and they replace the old generation. Now, that hasn't happened in economics. The same belief system continues being picked up and perpetuated.
We can talk about all that, why that is, but I just reminded, like in university, there's also like theology. You can study
like a theology.
Theology, like let's call this the science of religion and all this. Maybe economics is like theology in a way?
I think all sciences are to some extent like theology, in the sense you have a set of unifying concepts you don't contradict. Okay, and you then try to extend what that explains for you. Kuhn's book, I think, is one of the great works of humanity, not just science. Okay, the structure of scientific revolutions, explaining how we develop a way of understanding the world. We push that as far as we can. It starts to break down. The breakdown means that alternative explanations are necessary. The believers in that paradigm aren't the ones to come up with it. Somebody outside normally does. That new explanation resolves the anomalies, but completely changes the perspective of the science. The old believers can't cope with it. New students are excited by the new paradigm. And when the old scientists are forced to retire by old age or death, then the new ones take over, and you get a scientific revolution by one new generation replacing the old. That doesn't happen in economics.
So, like, you were born in 1953. You were born in 1953.
I now get into who I am. Yeah, that's right.
In Sydney. So I guess you probably went to university in Sydney around 73-ish?
71, yeah.
71. What were you taught?
I started off with the straight neoclassical stuff. Like this is going to sound like the typical old man's put down to the new generation, but in my day, we learnt more advanced economics in high school than you get in university these days.
Really? What? Really?
Yeah, the textbooks we used, things like indifference curves and all this sort of stuff was taught to year 11 and 12 students. And I was thoroughly seduced by it. I thought it was fabulous.
Why?
I had one.
Where were you seduced by it?
Well, first, my interest originally was in physics. I wanted to become a physicist, but I went to a Catholic school with a pathetically bad science teacher. And I had him for 6 years. And after 6 years of this, he was a nice human being. He meant well, but he just could not cope with the discipline. 6 years of that, I was pretty damn bored, unfortunately. And we got a great teacher in year 11 of economics. His name was Tim Keating. There's no relation to the guy who became Prime Minister some years later, but Tim Keating was a brilliant teacher and made me really excited about economics, and explained, as part of what he explained Rostow's theory of economic growth. And that was a process of cumulative causation. One thing causes something else, then it feeds back and you get an amplifying feedback. And I thought that was great, and that's what I expected to see more of when I got to university. And I got the same old supply and demand stuff when I got to university, so I was slightly disappointed by that. But the real hole in my thinking was driven by a professor called Frank Stilwell. And Frank became professor of political economy at Sydney University sometime after that. And Frank taught us what's called the theory of the second best. Ever heard of that?
No.
Okay. Now that, I think it won a Nobel Prize for the people who found it. Lancaster is one of the academics who did. And that said, you get the the fundamental argument of neoclassical economics is, perfect competition is the best possible arrangement, and that applies in the labour market as well. So you'll get the best situation socially and economically if workers compete against each other and capitalists compete against each other for setting the wage. But in the real world, we have trade unions and we have employer associations. So they said if we're 2 steps away from perfection, so rather than having competitive workers facing competitive firms, you have organised workers facing organised firms. What happens if you remove one but not both of those imperfections? And according to the theory of the second best, you reduce social welfare.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, that was my reaction, because before this class, before this lecture, I'd accepted the idea we should abolish unions and abolish monopolies and have a much better world if we do all that stuff.
Okay.
And then the lecturer explains using strictly neoclassical tools, supply and demand, marginal cost and marginal social revenue, I think it was called. There's marginal cost, but also a second marginal curve coming out of the monopsony. It was a monopoly analysis. And he explained, just using the standard, extended version of standard theory, that if you abolish the trade union or the employer association, you would end up with a social welfare situation which is provably worse than if you had continued with both of them. And I thought, this is crazy for 2 reasons. One, because it implies if you want to reform capitalism, you've got to reform everything all at once. And that's just impossible, okay? And secondly, why wasn't I being taught this in my textbook? So I read through the textbook and I found no mention of this particular theory. I went down to the library straight after the lecture and read the original papers. And then I thought, well, what else am I not being taught? So I went to grab a copy of the Economic Journal, which I thought would be the prominent, most useful journal. And I think as it was the latest version that was bound with either 65 or 66. It was a long physical delay in getting from journals. This is long before TikTok and everything else. So we had physical copies in libraries.
Right.
And the binding process took for ages. So 65 or 66 was the first paper, and I opened up the Economic Journal to find papers by Marxists, a guy called Baduri. Because this is strange. What a Marxist. I thought they were just left-wing socialists. Why are they being published by the Economic Journal? And I read their papers and I discovered something which is called the Cambridge controversies over the definition of capital. And then I managed to get the 1966 edition, I think it was, maybe 65, where Paul Samuelson was fighting to defend the neoclassical school against the critics from Cambridge, UK, who were attacking it, Joan Robinson, the most prominent, but Pierre Schaffer, quite a few non-orthodox thinkers. And in this paper called A Summing Up, Samuelson conceded defeat. Okay? The final paragraph of the paper says something like this: if all the above makes you nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical discourse, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy life. We must accept and apprise the facts of life. And I thought, first of all, wow, okay, he conceded defeat in the debate, but I've got his 71 textbook.
Yeah.
There's no mention of that in here.
Did you go to your professor and ask?
Huh?
Did you go to your professor and ask about it?
Yeah, I did.
Like, what the fuck, man?
I know, exactly. And I thought, this is crazy. Why is this stuff happening and not turning up in the textbooks?
Right.
Why are we not saying, okay, if we can't define capital this way, we have to define it a different way? And this destroys the theory of the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, gets destroyed by this as well. So all this stuff should have been happening, and it wasn't. And I thought, what the hell's going on here? And largely it comes down to this religious belief aspect. You have a paradigm that tells you not only this is the way the world works, but this is the best way the world can work. There's something utopian about the neoclassical vision. Market systems are better than command economies. Free competition is better than concentrations. Perfectly competitive firms are better than monopolies, et cetera, et cetera. And it actually makes you a believer in a utopia, okay? It's a utopian system. You get paid your marginal product. You get paid what you contribute to society. You get your utility maximising bundle given your budget constraints and so on. We're all individuals. We don't have all this class stuff that was part of the classical school. So in that sense, it's describing a perfect world. And that is so hard for people to move away from, that when they find anomalies like Blinder found back in the 90s, they just waffle past them and go back to rejoin their religion, or you get people who break away. And I'm one of the breakaways, obviously. But there's lots of people who've swallowed the neoclassical line for a while and then get to a certain point in their career and think, this just doesn't make sense. And then they have to have the question is, do they have the courage to break away, or do they stick inside the conventional beliefs? And the majority stick inside the conventional beliefs.
It's funny that you just mentioned the Nobel Prize for economics. I mean, this is like a made-up thing. Like there's no original Nobel Prize,
original Nobel Prize
for economics, and it's not even doesn't even come from the Nobel Prize Committee, right?
It's funded by the Swedish Central Bank.
Yeah, it's like
a good friend of mine, Abner Offer, wrote the definitive book on that. And do you know the story behind the Nobel Prize itself? It's actually quite funny. Because Nobel, of course, invented dynamite.
Right.
I think he was in Russia at the time, and his brother died, and the newspapers mistook his brother's death for his own death. So Nobel got to read his own obituaries. Okay. And they said he was responsible for more deaths than anybody in history. So an incredibly disparaging view of himself. So he decided to build the Nobel Prizes as a way of whitewashing his own reputation. Very successful. But he specified physics, obviously, chemistry, medicine,
peace,
and literature.
Oh yeah.
Okay. And those were the 5 prizes. And I don't know for sure, but I believe the suggestion was made, what about economics? And he said, no, it's not a science. Okay? So that was back in the 1880s or thereabouts, 1890s, I'm not sure the actual date. But in 1969, I think it was, the Swedish Central Bank was having a battle over social democratic policies in Sweden, and they decided to establish it's called, I can't pronounce the name properly, but the Sveriges Rijksbank Prize in economics in honour of Alfred Nobel.
Oh.
That's what they called it. And they said they'd fund it as well. So it isn't paid for by the Nobel Foundation.
Exactly.
The $1.4 million equivalent Swedish krona supplied by the central bank. And that was deliberately done. And Avner Offer goes through this very well.
To make it a science.
Make it look like a science, and it's worked.
Yeah.
Okay. People, because they get a Nobel Prize for it, it's treated on the same grounds as the prize for physics, chemistry, and it's garbage.
I mean, do you still follow who gets it every year?
No, I mean, to me, the ultimate.
What if they came and like, oh, Steve, like you debunked all this neoclassical scientists. You should get this prize.
Oh, I'd take the money.
Of course.
Okay. As did Friedrich Hayek. And if you read Hayek's speech, he actually said there should not be a prize in economics. Yes, he does. I think he was the 2nd or 3rd recipient. Okay, but he said there should not be a prize. It's not a science. Okay, and I'd be coming in. I'd take the money and say the same thing, because I'll never get it, obviously.
Of course.
But Hayek argued that it was not a science.
So back to you as a student.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Why didn't you just quit studying economics if you realized, okay, this is bullshit? Or how did you go on?
Well, I was doing an arts law degree. Okay, so when I went to go to university, I saw a career advisor, and he asked me what did I want to do, and I said I want to do economics and engineering, but there's no such combination. And at the same time, I was the school's top debater. Debating, we never did well internationally in the national competitions, but I was always the top point scorer. And people thought I was a great arguer. You should be a lawyer. So the guy said, do law. So I did an arts law degree, and that meant rather than just doing like the straight economics courses, I did economics, psychology, and mathematics, and as well as the legal history subject. So my career expectation was that I'd end up being a lawyer. So, and that might have been a factor as why I didn't drop out straight away. But I continued on, and I found that it wasn't like I went from being a complete believer in the theory and pro, free market thinking, et cetera, within weeks to think this is all bullshit. I've been lied to? What the hell's going on here? And I found a large number of the staff felt the same way.
Oh.
So Frank Stillwell was one. A guy called Jock Collins was another rebel against the mainstream. Paul, can't think of Paul's last name now. About a dozen of the staff were critics of the mainstream. Mm-hmm. So there's always been contestation inside economics. And you had people who called themselves, they were Marxian economists. I think there was one Marxian economist in the department at the time. People coming from different schools of thought. Mm-hmm. And like when I was talking about the Economic Journal publishing articles by Marxists, this happened 50 and 60 years ago. So there was a range of dispute and different schools of thought, a bit like you find in political science. Not everybody in political science is a right-wing nutcase or a left-wing nutcase. Mm-hmm. You've got a whole range, and they expect to have a range there. So economics, when I was going through university, still had that flavour of contesting views about how the economy functions. So it wasn't unusual to have people who rejected the neoclassical paradigm and were full-time members of staff. That was quite common.
It's always easy to ask like German economists who are here, like when we talk about how it all started, that university, and I always ask like if they, read like the origins of their science.
Yeah,
I mean they consider them scientists or like go along and like okay, so the origins of economics seems to be like okay, it started with Marx, Adam Smith. And all that, like, did you get to read it at a university, or was it like voluntarily? Or
well, once I realised I was being conned by my textbooks. Uh-huh. I mean, I really was being conned by them. There's no way I was going to rely upon textbooks anymore. So what I'd do is I'd go around and read the journals, and I'd read the original literature. Yeah. And I went back as far as a group called the Physiocrats, which predate the classical school. And I've since come to regard them as the correct school of economics, where we should have taken our lead from. Not the classicals, not the neoclassicals.
The
physiocrats.
Like who think like everything comes from Mother Earth or something?
That's the way they saw it. And they made one mistake, which was critical, but their basic vision was that wealth comes from the land, okay? What they call the free gift of nature. Mm. And like when you put that in modern terms, what that says is wealth comes from energy.
The sun.
Okay? Yeah. Nobody made the sun. Okay, it's sitting there in the sky. Plants absorb the energy. Mm-hmm. Some of those plants get crushed over millions of years and turn into coal and oil and so on. So it's the free gift of energy that lets us have a human civilization. Otherwise, we'd be, running around the African plains is just another bunch of strange-looking apes. Okay, so the fact we can build this sophisticated society comes from the fact we exploit energy, and the only group of economists that had that as their founding ideas were the physiocrats. The most well-known is Francois Keynes, but I actually prefer the writing of some of the others. There's one called Richard Cantillon, and he wrote a book called the A Treatise on Economic Theory, which was published in English, I think, about 11 years before Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, with a completely contradictory analysis to Smith. And Turgot, and Turgot has like a male-female name, Marie, a man with the name Marie and a couple of other French female names. And Turgot, I think, was the most eloquent of the lot. And he basically said that all wealth comes from what they called the husbandman, which is the farmer. And he says he sells what he does not buy.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the idea, of course, you don't buy the sun, but you're selling what the sun creates. Okay. And that, he says, is the ultimate source of all wealth. And then the rest of society distributes that through. Now, those concepts are being talked about by these largely French economists, 70 or so years before the word energy was actually invented. It was only coined in 1809 by an English polymath. Yeah. Okay. The word it's an invented word. Okay. Okay.
I didn't know that.
That didn't come out till about 1809. So what they were saying was fundamentally consistent with this idea that the free gift of nature is energy. Okay? So that's correct. That's where wealth comes from. Now, if you read Richard Cantillon, and it's saying, I think it was 1859 that his book was published in English. It was published in French before that. Smith read French. Smith went to meet the physiocrats before he became a famous academic. So he knew of their work. And Candelon's books open says land is a source of all wealth. Okay, and then you read the opening paragraph of Smith. Labour is the source of all wealth. Okay, now I believe you can't prove it because Smith actually instructed his maid or whoever was taking care of his affairs to destroy all his papers on his death. So we can never find out what Smith, we can't find the rough notes of Smith to find out what he actually thought to get there. My belief is that he confronted the views the physiocrats had, saying land is the source of all wealth, but they said manufacturing is sterile. Okay? That's actually the word they used to describe the manufacturing sector. So that all wealth comes from agriculture, and then what happens is manufacturing converts that wealth into a different form. So you take wheat by various processes, you help it to make carriages, that was the term they used, and the carriages don't create any additional wealth. Now Smith quite rightly had a difficult time coping with that because coming from, at the time, highly industrialised Scotland, low agriculture, high industry, it didn't make sense that manufacturing wasn't productive. Okay? So his substitution was to say it's not land that gives us wealth, it's labour and the division of labour that gives us wealth. Okay? And then that idea of land and therefore energy being the source of a real source of wealth gets forgotten and lost. And then you have the battle between the classical school, largely in the persona of Marx, where Marx says, okay, labour is the source of all value. So why did the capitalists get it?
Yeah.
Okay, Marx is far more sophisticated than that, but that's the way he's interpreted. So what happened in Marx's hands, the classical school became a criticism of capitalism rather than a defence. And when that happened in the 1860s with the publication of Capital, that's when you had the growth of the neoclassical school at the same time, saying value doesn't come from labour, it comes from labour and capital together, creating utility.
So the classical economists like Marx, they were attacking capitalism or formulating a critique of capitalism?
It turned into one. Like when you look at what Smith and Ricardo were doing, they were basically criticising feudal systems. Okay? Yeah. They were saying, get rid of all these feudal imposts, let the market work more efficiently, you'll get a better society if we can remove all the feudal imposts like the Corn Laws and so on. So they were anti-feudal and pro-capitalist. Okay. But in Marx's hands, it turned to being anti-capitalist and pro-socialism. And like a lot of people have a hard time coping with why would you do that. But if you think about what London was in Marx's time, my analogy for it is Calcutta in the 1970s. Because Marx was ultimately exiled from every country except England, living in Chelsea, and he and Jenny moved out of Chelsea at one point. Have a guess why? Because of a cholera outbreak. Okay? Now, we don't associate cholera with London anymore, though the way the water systems are going over there, maybe we will. But that's the state of life at the time. The state of the working class was awful. Okay, you had 6 days of labour, up to 14-hour days, effectively close to subsistence wages, horrible pollution. And in that environment, of course people were saying this is an awful system, we should change it, we should rebel from it. So it's understandable that left-wing twist on pro-capitalist classical school changed the classical school over time. And when Marx came out with Das Kapital, which was saying capitalism will have to collapse. And
at some point.
At some point. He was wrong about his logic there. I'm happy to talk about that too. But that argument was a strong impetus for the pro-market, what we now call neoclassical school. And you can find the origins of that again in France. Augustin Cournot, who was a mathematician, writing in the early 1800s, and Jean-Baptiste Say, who was both a friend and a foil for Ricardo. They both argued utility is the source of value. Okay? You make something more useful, you create value. And that's the whole orientation of the neoclassical school.
So like the classical economists like Marx, they were basically anti-capitalism, and the neoclassical...
Pro-capitalism.
They were created because to defend capitalism?
They weren't created to defend it. They naturally, like Say, was absolutely pro-capitalism. Okay? The best possible social system. It's all about utility maximisation, et cetera, So it's a shift in where they think value comes from, because the basis of the physiocrats was value comes from nature, and again, it's objective. Okay, you can measure the amount of energy effectively you get coming in, the amount of energy you've got to use to harvest it. If there's a gap between the two, you get a net product. That's all objective.
Sure.
The classical school says labour's the source of value. You can measure the number of hours it takes to make something. You can measure the number of hours effectively gets sold for. That's subjective. This neoclassical school is subjective. It's all about utility maximisation. You create value by giving something more utility. Okay, that's how you create value. And you cannot you can't compare one person's utility to another person's utility.
So like Marx would just say like we're sitting on a chair.
Yeah.
So we're both sitting. So that's the use of the chair.
That's true. Yeah.
And the neoclassical ones, they would
say how comfortable the chair makes you feel. You can be feeling far more comfort than I am in this chair.
Although we're sitting on the same chair.
Sitting on the same chairs, yeah, okay. So
everything is subjective then?
So?
Everything is subjective because every human has different...
And therefore you get caught up in how do you aggregate when you say everything is subjective and individual. And that's the core problem with the neoclassical school. Because they start off by saying we're going to say everything is subjective, but then we're going to add up subjective stuff. And that's where the fun and games occur, because every time they try to do it, they get caught in the mathematical conundrum.
But why did you find out why they did that? Like, why would they come up with this? Okay, let's add this comfortable variable. Does it make sense, or was it a good idea?
It does make sense to come forward as an explanation of the capitalist system, because when you look at the state of humanity for the previous, let's say 800 years, go for the UK from 1000 AD to roughly the 1800s, there was no particular change in the standard of living of the poor over that period, and no particular change in the standard of living of the rich over that period either. Okay? Now, the turning point was the Industrial Revolution, and the cause of that turning point was coal. Okay, it was energy, the use of energy at the time. But what it meant was a whole range of new and fascinating products are turning up. So the steam engine is the obvious one for industrial production, but you start getting not just clocks in a building, but you start getting fob watches, and you get, rather than having low-grade iron, you start getting steel. I don't know when steel turned up, but quality items are turning up all the time, and the range of things you can enjoy are rising all the time. So it makes sense. It's quite feasible to say, well, there's something about adding utility that is the defining feature of capitalism. We've had this feudal system for 800 years. Nothing really changed over time. Now we get into this capitalist system, and suddenly we're seeing inventions and new devices turning up, and this is improvement in the utility of life, and that's what you identify with capitalism. And then you see adding utility as the basis of adding value. So I can understand how it came about. Okay?
But it didn't make sense after.
Well, the trouble is it makes it impossible to make aggregation. If you read, I recommend reading for the fun of it a book by Jean-Baptiste Say called A Catechism of Political Economy. And he sets up this dialogue between himself and a disciple, asking him questions about where does value come from and what's the role of money, et cetera, et cetera. And virtually everything you can find in neoclassical economics today, you can find there. And a large part of it is you can't make interpersonal comparisons of utility. Okay, one person can't know what utility somebody else gets. You can't say that if you take from the poor and take from the rich and give to the poor, you're going to improve overall utility. The rich might get much more utility out of what you give to the poor than the poor get, et cetera, et cetera. Now, okay, fine, but then you try to build an aggregate theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply on that basis. You've got to add up. And then you get caught in all sorts of mathematical conundrums. And the response to the mathematical conundrums is, rather than honestly saying, hang on, we can't do it, either we've got to change our foundation or we've got to change some of the way we think about the market, they don't do it. The original picture of a utility maximising individual and a profit maximising firm and reaching an equilibrium price between the two where you get maximisation of producer and consumer surplus, it's a vision of an ideal world, and it all revolves around achieving equilibrium. Okay? So this becomes, again, in a sense, a religious element of the theory. You can't challenge equilibrium. Okay? And that has distorted the potential for the discipline to be scientific. And I've given up on I've been fighting them for 50 years now. And I know the people I was fighting 50 years ago, my opponents on the neoclassical side, knew more about neoclassical economics than the modern lot do. The modern ones don't even know their own history, let alone history that goes before them, whereas people like Warren Hogan at Sydney University was aware of some of the history of economic thought. And it's become a very barren discipline these days.
It's always amazing to have the leading German economists here, and they're like, no, I didn't read about Marx and Keynes and Adam Smith. Maybe I tried it maybe, and it was too complicated or something. And whatever, something that's their attitude. Basically.
I know. I was lucky because I had some great teachers at Sydney University.
And they always say Marx is wrong.
So?
They always say Marx is wrong anyway, so I didn't have to read it.
Yeah, the thing is, they're wrong. They're right that it's wrong, but they're wrong about why it's wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so my very first academic papers, like in the economic journal, I published a paper on journalism in China. My very first academic piece was in 1982 or 83, I think, long before I became an academic. That's one of these little funny by-the-bys.
Wow. Wow. Journalism in China.
Yeah. I took a bunch of journalists for a tour of China in 81, 82.
Okay.
And wrote about the experience that got published in the Australian Journal of Chinese Affairs.
Was Mao still alive?
Mao had just died about 2 or 3 years earlier. Right. Madame Mao had taken over. You had what called the Gang of Four, which these days people probably think is a boy band, but it was Madame Mao and her 3 main supporters. And I don't know how, I've never actually looked at the history of it, but Deng Xiaoping somehow got out of exile, came back and overthrew them. And when we were in Beijing with this conference between Australian journalists and Chinese journalists, the trial of the Gang of Four was going on and was being broadcast live through loudspeakers all over the city. So I wrote about the whole experience. It was a very remarkable time to be in China.
Was it your last time, or did you?
No, I've been back plenty of times since then.
Interesting.
And that's in a sense the Chinese communist experience is the classic antidote to the argument, let's leave it to the market.
What I like on the show, we always talk about, okay, we need to come up with a new economic system.
Yep.
Because capitalism.
A new way of thinking about economics.
Yeah, because the capitalism, global capitalism is destroying our planet, through endless growth, emissions, destroying the rest of the biosphere and animals and plants and all this. So it would be smart to come up with a new thing. Sure, right? And the economists, that you're fighting, they're always like, so what do you want? What would you call it? And I always wonder, when they're when 200 years ago, people abandoned feudalism. Yeah, that they just come up with, okay, let's start capitalism, and that's what we're going to abandon feudalism, or
it was an evolutionary thing. I mean, because when you look back at the feudal period, a large amount of output was produced on feudal estates, but some things couldn't be produced on the feudal estate, so you had to have trade, and the trade was done by merchants, and merchants had to live in the cities, and to take their goods through from one feudal fief to another, they had to pay imposts at each one. Okay, so they were anti the feudal system because it was just taking money out of their pockets,
right,
for no good reason.
The king wanted a share.
Yeah, and so that and also the feudal system wasn't going to ever innovate to a substantial degree, whereas the merchants were coming up with new products and they would gain if they managed to produce something which was suddenly could be sold much more effectively than
but the merchant didn't like come up with like a conference or like, okay, let's.
I don't think there was ever a capitalist manifesto.
Yeah, let's found a new way of doing the economy.
You have people trying to analyze, how do we produce output? How is prices set? This has been something which you can find literature going back on 5, 6. You can find it in Aristotle.
Really?
Okay. And what's called the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle discusses what determines value. And he comes up with both the labour theory of value and the utility theory of value in the same chapter. Okay. So this dispute goes back, 3,000 years. But yeah, capitalism evolved out of feudalism. You can see the process, and you had the revolutions that occurred, the wars, and so on.
But when did people or scientists realize, okay, this is not feudalism anymore. This is something new. Like we need to come up with a new name or something.
Yeah, well, I think Marx actually invented the word capitalism.
Really?
I think. I'm not sure. Huh. But I can't remember seeing the word capitalism in Ricardo or Smith or any of the predecessors. But certainly you find it in Marx talking about the capitalist system. Yeah. Okay. So Marx probably the first one to come up with a term, and it's a reasonable description. Okay? But its system, it's evolved out of the previous social systems. There wasn't a particular, let's have a capitalist revolution point. And I think it's only been successful because of the exploitation of energy. That's what gave it the real impetus. And the part of the stimulus it gives that if you come up with a new idea, we all know James Watt for the steam engine, and I'm trying to remember the name of the person who invented the one that he modified. But there's a previous Scottish inventor who came up with the steam engine itself. It's Bill Connon or some name like that. I just can't drag it out of my brain right now. But his version can you heat a cylinder to cause a piston to move up and then do work, but then he'd try to cool the steam inside the same cylinder. Right. And what great name, what worked out was that if you cooled it in a separate condenser, you could much more rapidly get the energy back down again and continue making the piston move. So Watt's true invention was just a way of making the previous, Morecambe or something like that, the previous system more efficient. Okay? But once you did that, we suddenly had the power of coal. Okay? So rather than having to use human energy or animal energy or minor versions of wind or water energy, suddenly you had this incredible amount of energy stored in coal. Now, the reason you did it was fundamentally capitalist. If you manage to make this invention work, you're going to make a fortune. So that the profit motive and that incentive for invention is something that makes capitalism more innovative than previous social systems, without a doubt. Okay, and I'm never going to argue against that. And in fact, what I find pathetic about the neoclassical point of view is it doesn't talk enough about where innovation comes from. It talks about equilibrium. Okay? It talks about homogeneous products. It doesn't talk about diversified products, which is the hallmark of capitalism. So it's a paean, a way of praising capitalism that talks about things that capitalism almost completely lacks. Equilibrium. What the hell is that? Yeah? Capitalism is not an equilibrium system. It's an evolutionary system. And we should be if we're going to talk about its strengths, then that's the main strength. The weakness is that it's one way to maximize your profit is to dump your costs on somebody else, to not pay your full costs, and not look at the side effects of what you're doing. And we are now at the limit of the biosphere's capacity to cope with that. You can understand it being done 200 years ago. But even there's a funny story, because Jean-Baptiste Say, who's French, was a great fan of Adam Smith, okay? Even though having a different theory of value. Say regarded Smith as the leading light who established the superiority of capitalism over feudalism. So he decided to go on a pilgrimage to Adam Smith's homeland. He only got halfway before he turned back to France again because he couldn't stand the pollution. all the steam, all the smoke, all the industrial waste, horrified him, and he went back to France. So it's I've forgotten why I'm actually telling a part of the story, but this
Tell it.
it's we have a vision of how capitalism works, which is fundamentally wrong. And a major part of what's wrong about it is the dumping of waste. Okay, and there's a limit to how much you can do of that. This is what my point, because back in the days of Smith, you had what I think it was Baumol termed the cowboy economy. Okay, wide open spaces. If you pollute somewhere, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, nobody cares.
Now we're living in the spaceship economy.
Right.
Okay, it does matter. We have to maintain the Earth system. And what we realise we're doing instead is destroying the Earth system. So we need a social system and a productive system that respects maintaining the biosphere. That has to be absolute first priority of humanity. And when you talk to scientists, that's the sort of orientation they have. They say life, so far as we know, and we know a hell of a lot about the universe now, so far as we know, this is the only planet that supports intelligent life.
Right.
Probably planets supporting, low levels of life, bacterial, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the only part of the only planet supporting intelligent life, and we're supposed to be the most intelligent species. And yet what we're doing is destroying the capacity of the biosphere to support life in general.
Yeah, and if these scientists, these neoclassical economists, think of themselves as scientists, shouldn't they think of that first and foremost?
In fact, they're the ones who got it turned us off thinking about it, because William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2018 for his work on climate change, his first major...
You should always be like the Nobel Prize.
Oh, yeah, I know. I get sick of it.
Quotation marks.
Yeah, quotation marks, definitely. His first major paper as a young-ish academic, published in 1972 or 73, was called Measurement Without Data. And that was an attack on the predecessor to the Limits to Growth study. Okay, and the Limits to Growth argued that if we continued on the trajectory we're currently on, we're going to reach some form of environmental constraints sometime in the early to mid 21st century, okay, which is what we're bloody well doing. Now, he trashed that work completely. He rubbished it, like the title itself, Measurement Without Data. Okay? So that was one of the major reasons that the approach that the Limits to Growth used, which is called system dynamics, never got into economics. Okay, he drove it out. Okay? And what he got the Nobel Prize for was really maintaining the neoclassical paradigm against attack from the outside. That's why you get the Nobel Prize. Okay, and what we have is economists who are completely ignorant about the role of energy in production. Their models of production do not include energy.
But wouldn't that be the smart way to go from their perspective? I mean, there's a alternative form of energy now. There's clean energy, the sun, wind and all this. Why don't they go that route? Like, why don't they abandon?
Well, they don't even see it's necessary.
Why don't they abandon the fossil energy stuff? Oil, gas, and coal?
You can't abandon what you don't realize you're using. Okay, this is the classic problem, because they have a model of production. There's many versions of production models they've had over time, but the one they've fallen into is called the Cobb-Douglas production function. Have you heard of that one?
No.
Okay. You probably managed to avoid that one at uni.
Yes.
Okay. That argues...
I quit early. So.
Good move.
Yeah.
That says output is produced by combining labour and capital and technology.
Right.
Okay. And the reason the model was adopted was when it was first proposed by a mathematician and an economist back in the 1920s. They fitted it to data, which they themselves put together, and the data returned numbers for the the exponents for the functions that fitted the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Like I said, workers get 70% of GDP. The exponent for workers was 0.7. Machines, capital, gets 30% of GDP. The exponent for capital is 0.3. was actually 0.75 and 0.25 in their first paper. And that basically gave them a theory of production which confirmed their theory of income distribution that says that workers get paid their marginal product and capitalists get paid their marginal product. So it's a theory of production which suits their theory of distribution. Okay? Now, when you look at how those numbers were derived, it's nonsense. They don't make any sense at all. Okay? If you do the numbers properly with modern data, rather than getting exponents of 0.75 for workers and 0.25 for capitalists, you'll get 0 to minus 0.15 for labour, okay, and 1 to 1.5 for capital. Okay, it just doesn't fit the data at all.
Yeah.
Okay, but if they admit that, and this reason is the role of energy comes in. Okay, and I can elaborate on that later. But the basic point is once you bring energy into your production function, everything else falls over. Nothing else makes sense. Why? Because it destroys your coefficients. Like if you had Rudy Bachman on this show?
Who?
Rudy Bachman.
No.
Good.
He wants to be on the show, so that's why I don't invite him.
Okay. No.
He's not. No.
Okay.
Sorry, Rudy.
Bachman
he's probably watching. Like he's watching.
He'll enjoy this too. He's going to. I'll expect to be attacked on Twitter shortly. He argued in the paper, I think in 2022, that losing access to Russian energy would only, like if you had lost 10% of the energy input for the German economy, at most you'd have a 1.5% fall in GDP. And the conventional theory says you'd have a 0.4% fall in GDP. And this is because when they include energy, they tack it on like another, what they call factor of production. Oh. So labour gets a coefficient of 0.7 because it gets 70% of GDP, and capital gets 0.3. And then you say, well, let's break capital down into machines and then energy. Energy is about 4%, so it gets a coefficient of 0.04. So that tells you double your energy input and you'll increase output by only 4%. Or cut it by 10%, you'll get an absolutely tiny change.
Right.
And that's not exactly what's happened out for Germany. Okay? Because, and this is where I got involved in this whole area, was by working out how you bring energy into production functions. And that was a simple little insight. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. Okay? So energy is not an independent factor of production. Okay. It's an input to labour and capital without which they can do no work. So suddenly energy becomes absolutely vital. If you have zero energy, you've got zero output. Now that bringing a piece of realism in, you can no longer have the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Well, that's so much a part of how they think about capitalism, they're not willing to let go. So the problem is
So they ignore.
Huh?
They just ignore energy.
Yeah. So like there's a book I was asked to write a review of for the Open Society Foundation recently by an English economist, Daniel Susskind. And the book is called Growth: A Reckoning. Okay? And it's not ranking particularly highly in sales, I'm pleased to say, but it's been listed as one of the top 20 economics books to 2024 by the Financial Times. Now, I read the thing and my main response was it was a waste of paper, because here's a book written about growth in 2024 that doesn't mention global warming.
What?
Yeah. The word warming turns up once. Not global warming, just warming.
Maybe use climate change or something.
No.
No?
No. Doesn't talk about it at all.
What?
No. Okay. Doesn't.
I mean, there's a correlation between economic growth and CO2 emissions.
There's no mention of it in the book, okay, in 2024. Now, how the hell can that happen? And it's really because he's basically channeled mainstream economics. That's what he's written up in the various models of production and theories of growth and so on. And he says the growth we got from the Industrial Revolution came from ideas.
Right.
Okay. Not energy, ideas. And there's no limit to ideas. There's no limit to growth. And he actually says at one point, you can have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Whoa.
That's literally a quote from that book.
Good.
Now, bullshit. I'm sorry. trying that out when you rely upon fossil fuels and you're dumping the waste into the environment and you're causing global warming, you're going to destroy our capacity to have a civilization. And they can write a book like this in 2024 and be completely unaware of that issue.
Back to the energy stuff,
Okay,
and how the neoclassical economists ignore the topics of energy. Why do they tell me, like, all we need to do when it comes to climate change and turning to clean energy is CO2 pricing?
Yeah.
Why is that the answer?
It's because that's the only way they can phrase the answer. To them, everything's about supply and demand reaching equilibrium, and the problem is that we have a externality. When you use fossil fuels to create goods and services, you're dumping the externality into the atmosphere.
Right.
So you've got to compensate for that failure of the market. You're producing too much, so therefore you put a price on the costs, and therefore you reduce output, and hunky-dory, you've solved the problem. That's the way they think. And the trouble is, it isn't just that they've done that. The work that Nordhaus and co. have done to quantify the threats of climate change is the worst research, the worst work I've read in my entire life, not just when I've been an economist. This is garbage work.
Okay.
So Nordhaus, for example, there's plenty of examples, but my favourite, because it's so outrageously stupid and it shows how blind economists are to this issue. In 1991, he had a paper published in the Economic Journal called "Too Slow or Not Too Slow," about the greenhouse gases. And in it, he said you can divide industry into three large categories. Industries that are significantly exposed to climatic variables, industries that are moderately exposed, and industries that are that's a hard word to say for somebody's English first language, negligibly exposed. Okay. Guess how much he put into the very exposed? Total percentage of GDP.
5%.
So?
5%.
Close. 3. Okay. Moderately exposed?
1%.
You're actually getting on. What about the I hate that word. Negligibly. Oh my God.
It's your mother tongue.
So it's my mother tongue, and I can't get the word.
I don't even try to say it.
Negligibly exposed. How much you reckon is negligibly exposed to climate change?
I don't even want to know.
87% of the economy. Okay. Right. Now the industries he listed.
So we don't have to worry about it, basically.
That's right. Yeah, it's a trivial thing. It's only going to affect 3%, and actually, there's partly that's going to be agriculture and forestry, obviously, and you're going to get some carbon dioxide, fertilizer out of it, so that's going to be better. Right. So literally, 87% will be negligibly exposed to climate change, and included all of manufacturing, all of mining, all of service industries, wholesale and retail services, all of finance, all of government, and he even included the rest of the world, which I thought was rather cute. This is table 5 from his paper in 1991. Now, the reason he could say that these industries were unaffected by climate change, firstly, is because he had no idea of the role of energy in production. You can't produce anything without energy, including manufacturing, including services. But the fun thing is he had mining unaffected by climate change. Someone must have told him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Oh, William, what about open cut mining?" So the next time he published a paper on this topic, he said underground mining, and he reduced the number from 87% to 85%. Now that shows that what he thinks exposed to climate means is exposed to the weather. Okay. He literally mistakes the climate just for weather. If you're not exposed to the weather, you're not exposed to climate change. Oh. And that's the sort of thinking that's gone into these models they've calibrated. So the most recent version of his, what he called the integrated assessment model, DICE, that stands for Dynamic Integrated Climate and Economy, his most recent version says that if there's 3 degrees of global warming by 2100, GDP will be 3% smaller than it would have been in the absence of climate change, 3.1%. Okay. You read climate scientists and they say 1.5 degrees is dangerous and 3 degrees is catastrophic. So the climate scientists are aware of the dangers of modifying the climate as drastically as we're doing, and economists have trivialised it. And there was a survey done of economists 2 years ago or 3 years ago by a pair called Howard and Sylvan, and they surveyed everybody who'd been published in one of the top 25 economics journals and asked them a whole set of questions, but one of them was about what they thought would happen to GDP on a trajectory from 1.5 degrees of warming by 2035 to 3 degrees by 2075, I think it was, 5 degrees by 2130, and 7 degrees by 2220. Okay? Now, the median prediction they gave was that GDP would be 20% lower.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
20% lower. Okay. Now, if you talk to climate scientists, anything above 5 degrees, forget it. Yeah. We're extinct.
Yeah.
Okay. So economists have trivialised it. They've stuck with this vision that it's just basically a change to the weather.
I mean, this whole CO2 pricing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not familiar with the international economists, but like there's like a huge scene in Germany. I mean, Ottmar Edenhofer, like he's famous for he's called Mr. CO2 pricing, and his answer is always like, okay, the best answer in our social market economy is that emitting CO2 and other gases they just need to be more and more expensive.
Yeah. And they're saying the price system can solve all problems.
Exactly.
And that's what they think. They can't get away from that way of thinking.
But like, is the idea itself, like, I mean, you can explain why it's not going to work, but the idea itself sounds kind of rational at first. Like, okay, if I do something and it's bad for the environment, and I have to pay more and more every year for doing it, my motivation to do it will decrease.
And
that sounds logical.
It sounds logical, and it's fitting in a framework where we're doing minor damage to the biosphere. And if that actually factored in the level of damages that climate scientists see, it wouldn't have been minor. Okay, you would have had a point where after a certain level of global warming, then basically civilization is impossible. Yeah. Okay, and at that point, you've got a discontinuity. It's 100% damages. You don't want to go there. Under no circumstances do you want to approach that level of damage to the biosphere.
Yeah, I mean, the climate scientists basically say, well, if you have the option to not emit any CO2, well, do that. Yeah, yeah.
It has to be the market. Their vision is the market will innovate and bring out and rapidly change it. Right. But the reality is that the process of innovation takes time. Okay, and it takes a huge amount of potential profitability. Right. And when you're trying to compete with oil and gas, the extent to which you need to increase the price in oil and gas to rule it out is just virtually impossible. And you have to have the infrastructure for it. You have to have a means for people to move around that doesn't involve four-wheel vehicles that consume petrol. Now, we didn't get to innovating to that scale, of any real significant scale, until Musk and Tesla in the late 2010s. Right. But if we were going to stop global warming by price system, this should have been happening back in the 1970s. Right. And instead,
and it hasn't worked.
We haven't. And the economists, a major reason for us doing this is, again, the terribly bad work they did to trivialise the dangers in the first place. So what they're saying is we want the price system to react to an estimate of the damages from climate change, which are trivially lower compared to what the actual damages are.
Right.
So economists have, as much as they say the price system needs to solve all problems, they've misled the price system by drastically underestimating the dangers.
But isn't like creating like a CO2 price system like a way of incentivizing?
It's also the sheer biological processes involved, because if we were having a problem with too much water vapor in the atmosphere, water vapor collapses rapidly. Okay, the extra moisture, without a higher temperature, it'll fall out of the air in a couple of days. Carbon dioxide lasts for over a century.
Right.
We're not used to things which accumulate,
Right.
dealing with stuff that accumulates. So once you've got the accumulation, you've got a trajectory for temperature rise, whether you like it or not, and you've then got to find some way to take that carbon out. Now, who's going to pay you to take carbon out of the atmosphere? So all these issues mean you can't think just in terms of what's profitable. Can I sell you a carbon dioxide extractor? I could sell you a plant maybe, okay? I could sell you a tree, but say I want to sell you something actually its function is to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's no market for it. Okay? So in that case, you've got to do something collectively. You have to make the collective decisions that say you start rapidly producing energy systems that don't involve carbon dioxide.
That sounds
They're
like
not going to work in Germany, is it?
Sounds like communism.
There you go. It won't happen.
But it's like
it will happen, but it won't happen because they want it to.
But isn't like the idea of CO2 pricing like this whole, in German we say Anreize, like incentives.
Yeah,
like you're incentivizing the players to you nudge them to
nudging is all you do.
Be more climate friendly.
Yeah.
Why do they always go with incentives?
Because
why don't they go with bans and prohibition? Of certain things like using coal, oil, gas.
Yeah, ban them.
Humanity could just be like, okay, we ban it. In the next 5 years, it's over.
They're against any intervention in the market system. The whole idea puts the market as the absolute primary decision-making system for the society. So if you want to have any change, you've got to implement it through the market system, and that means pricing, not bans.
But the market system created the problem
in the first place. And there's such things that what they're not aware of, and this is where the ignorance about energy comes from again. The enormous profitability that did exist, it's rapidly declining, but exists with mining fossil fuels. You don't pay anything for the fossil fuels themselves. This comes back to the point that physiocrats made. Nobody made this stuff. You find it. All you've got to do is, back when we first discovered oil, drill a hole in the ground that it gushes out. The hard thing is stopping it gushing too much. Okay? Yeah. So drill a hole, bang, enormous profitability out of what you can sell the oil for. And that's how we replaced whale oil with fossil fuel oil. And that was a radical transformation in society. The profitability is so high and the amount of energy stored is so enormous, we still haven't worked out a way to beat that energy density that oil has. We get greater energy density out of nuclear, but we still haven't produced nuclear systems as yet with the low cost elements, cost per unit, compared to fossil fuels. So the price advantage they have, because you're not actually paying the price, you get the stuff for free in that sense. We didn't create it. We didn't make it. You've got to make a nuclear power station. That's a huge advantage. And you can't fight that advantage by saying, let's nudge the price let's make it slightly more expensive.
But I wasn't alive back then, but like in West Germany in the 70s and 80s, there were like the huge chemical companies. They were polluting the rivers in Germany, and the rivers, you couldn't swim in them anymore, and Germans hated that. Yeah. And instead of like incentivizing
you banned them.
Those companies, the politics, they banned polluting the river. Yeah. And that actually turned out to be that like the German chemical companies became very innovative, and they became world market leaders because they were forced to work more cleanly than their competitors worldwide. Yeah. So it was actually a good thing to just ban it outright.
Yeah. There are times when that can be very creative, having to get around a regulation where you're not allowed to pollute.
Yeah. Like an engineer once told me like he only gets creative when there's like a
regulations to force them into doing it. Yeah. So
So why do these?
Because if you look at their basic model, the intersecting supply and demand curves. Okay? If you get any intervention, you move away from equilibrium, and that's bad. So that's the mindset they start. They're not even conscious of it a lot of the time. Their opening perspective says any intervention into the market will make things worse. So they're against bans, they're against controls, but sometimes, as you say, in issues like pollution, like 100% you cannot pollute, you can't dump this stuff into the river. And then what that gives you is, you say, the motive for engineers to go and do the innovation. So the innovation doesn't come from the price system.
I actually, I mean, maybe you know, I wonder if these kind of economists argued against abolishing slavery.
There's certainly some who did.
It was like a ban of owning people.
Yeah. So I mean, there were elements of that, but I wouldn't put that down. Quite a few of the economists were great libertarians at the same time.
Yeah.
So the idea of compelling somebody to work, that went against their ethos. But I don't think they would have been leading the marches against it either. You would have seen the lawyers actually doing that more than the economists. But yeah, commodifying everything, treating everything as a commodity. That's an essential way the way they think, and it doesn't work when you live in a biological system.
What's the difference between neoclassical economists and neoliberal?
Neoliberal is the political wing of neoclassical economics.
Oh.
Like in some ways it originated in my country, in Australia, because there was a...
It was your fault.
It was our fault, yeah. Aussies are... We've got a few sins. But the Australian... we had a Conservative Party in power called the Liberal Party, but it's actually a Conservative Party from 1951 to 1972, okay? 21 years of ruling with no change of the political party. And then we had a left-wing Labor Party come in, led by a guy called Gough Whitlam, who was a great lawyer and a great orator, but he swallowed economics hook, line and sinker as well without understanding it. Okay? So he got into power, and this was at the time of the inflationary takeoff in the early 70s as well, like global inflation, and that was blamed upon his policies. Usual sort of story, Global phenomenon, it's your fault. This seems to be the nature of politics.
Same here.
Yeah, and anyway, the party went down in a screaming heap. They won one election and they got wiped out at the next election, and the subsequent election was actually politically engineered. The government was sacked by the Governor General.
Okay.
This is back in 1975. Okay? Okay. And then the Labor Party was so scarred by the experience that they've developed this idea of we have to show we manage the economy better than the Conservatives do. But what we're going to do is we're going to follow the economic textbooks, and we're going to do socially progressive policies as well at the same time.
Sounds like German social democrats.
I was never a member. I joined the ALP for 1 year, the Australian Labor Party, and I was so bored by being part of a member, I didn't renew my membership. That's the one time I've ever formally joined a political party. I actually ran for politics, but that's another story, which went nowhere in 2022, so that doesn't really count. But I joined the Labor Party and just found in branches you were just there to go and hand out leaflets and elect it was boring as batshit. But I was also involved in political debates with some of the leaders of the party at the time because of my involvement with the trade union. And one of the leading guys was a guy called Lindsay Tanner. I don't know if he's still alive. He probably is. But Tanner was one who was saying we've got to show we're better economic managers than the Conservatives are, and we can because we manage the economy better, we can be better on social policies as well. And I was saying at this stage as a critic, look, follow the textbooks, you're going to stuff up. They don't describe the real world. You're going to create a disaster. And when that happens, you'll end up bringing your social policies into disrepute. And I think that's what's happened over time because with neoliberalism combined neoclassical economics with so-called progressive social policies. And then what we have is, the financial crisis in 2008. We have unaffordable housing in most of the world, not Germany so far as I'm aware, but most of the... So?
Try living in Berlin.
Okay. Yeah. I prefer Amsterdam.
It gets more and more unaffordable. We can talk about that later.
Okay. But what you got was a whole series of social economic breakdowns which weren't supposed to happen. Like follow economics textbook, you're supposed to reach equilibrium, okay?
Right.
You're supposed to grow more rapidly. Now, if you take a look at the rate of economic growth between 1950 and 1975, which is 25 years when you can say is the non-neoliberals are in charge, Keynesians, roughly speaking, okay? And you compare it to after the neoliberalism took over, 75 to, say, 20. You can't include the COVID period. You've got to leave that out. Look at the rate of economic growth. The rate of economic growth under the Keynesians was about, in the American data, about 1.5% per year higher than under the neoliberals. So the one way they sold themselves was, the neoliberal, like Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher and so on, we'll have a market system, get rid of all these terrible interventions by the Keynesians, all these controls and so on, get rid of them. We'll grow so rapidly you won't need welfare in the future.
Because everybody has a job. And,
and you'll be paid well and paid what you deserve, and it will grow so much faster.
Let's forget about the seniors and the kids who need help. No,
well, they were supposed to be, covered out of your altruism.
Oh, okay.
But the result is, in fact, we grew more slowly. So on their own very basis of expecting a higher rate of economic growth, there's been a lower rate of economic growth. Rather than more stability, we had the financial crisis in 2007. We had the stock market crash in 87. We had the breakdown of the dot-com bubble in 2001. There's been instability. So everything they promised they were going to deliver, they've failed on.
But if there's less growth than through Keynesian economics, if there's less profits, why do they still hang out to this ideology then?
Because
who profits from neoclassical economics then?
Not neoclassical economists, funnily enough. They're not particularly well paid. But it's a power.
In whose interest is it?
I don't think it's in anybody's interest, frankly. There's no benefit in the collective or individual sense of using a bad theory.
But somebody must.
Well, I think it gives power.
To whom?
To the wealthy, to the Rupert Murdochs of the world, to the upper end of the income distribution has done dramatically well.
But were they not powerful before?
Yeah, and I think they'd be better off if they hadn't destroyed all the non-market elements of the previous Keynesian system. They've done a huge damage to the productive capability of the economy whilst thinking they were improving it. And that particularly applies to their theories about money.
But this ideology doesn't only help the billionaires and the super billionaires or something, but this drives political policies everywhere.
I know.
And all the parties, like even in Germany, except maybe one party, like they follow that stuff.
It's a mind virus. It's just become the way everybody thinks about, not everybody, but the vast majority think about how the economy operates comes down to saying you can't have government intervention, you can't have government deficits, any intervention in the market system will make it work less well, et cetera, and it becomes a religion in that sense. But if you look at its performance, what were you trying to achieve? A high rate of economic growth. What did you achieve? A lower rate of economic growth. There's something wrong. But the thing is, people, because you live in the moment, you don't necessarily see those effects over time. You've got to be my age, or you've got to have access to data and say, can I do these data comparisons? What do I see? And you look at it and think, well, the neoliberal period, whose ambition was to grow more rapidly than the previous Keynesian period, has failed. And then you'd say, well, there's something wrong with neoliberalism. Where are the flaws? And look for them and say, okay, honestly, this ideology hasn't worked. Now, instead, because people, live from minute to minute in many ways, they don't look at the history and say, we've gone badly wrong somewhere, what did we do wrong, and reassess it. The momentum of the system carries it forward.
Like, back to your time at university.
Yep.
Did you learn why the economy needs to grow every year?
This is...
I mean, this is not a neoclassical idea. The Keynesians want growth as well.
Yeah, it's just locked into our thinking because economic growth is absolutely essential to the way economists think.
Why?
Because they largely...
Did you learn the why at university?
Not really, no.
Did they teach you?
You learn it by being a critic and learning outside, but why the obsession with growth?
Yeah.
You'll see people like, you read people like Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, The Limits to Growth, all this, which I did read in my youth. And so I say growth will cause a crisis on a finite planet. The idea
there can't be infinite growth on a finite planet.
There cannot. The opposite of that statement I quoted from Susskind.
Exactly.
You cannot have it. But I mean, I understand part of the motivation Okay? Because if you look at the standard of living we had back in the 1700s and compare it to now, I mean, the fact we're even doing this, talking after the sun's gone down with plenty of light, we take that for granted these days. That just didn't happen 200, 300 years ago. Yeah. The products we consume, the standard of living we have is huge. Yeah. And that's obviously very stimulating to continue behaving in that way.
Thanks, capitalism.
Yeah.
Sure.
But at the same time, we have to look at, is it sustainable on this planet?
Exactly.
Okay? But also, I mean, I go beyond that. Is this planet sustainable? And again, we've learned an incredible amount about reality over the last quarter millennium. Mm. If you go back 250 years, we thought we were the only, we thought our solar system and the stars we could see in the sky were the extent of the universe. In about 1930, I think it was, Hubble spotted that the Andromeda cloud was not a cloud, but was actually a separate galaxy. Mm-hmm. Now we know there's hundreds of billions of galaxies. Mm-hmm. We also know that the sun has a life cycle, and if the sun goes through the standard sequence, in about 5 billion years it'll become a red giant. And as a red giant, I believe its orbit will be out to the Mars. Mm-hmm. So the Earth is gone.
So we have 5 billion years left to grow.
Less than that, because the sun is slowly expanding. It's not what's causing global warming now, but it will cause warming over time. Mm-hmm. So as it expands in about something in the order of 500 million to a billion years, the radiation from the sun will mean life is no longer possible on this planet.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you think in those terms, and you'll see people like, what's his name? Brian, I can't think of his last name, not Brian Greene, but a leading English popular physicist. Yeah. He says, look, we have to see our responsibility of enabling life to continue. Yeah. So far as we're aware, this is the only planet in this galaxy that supports life. Certainly intelligent life. We've seen no signs of intelligent life anywhere else in the galaxy. This is the Fermi paradox. Where are they? So if that's true, if we are the only, especially if we're the only intelligent life in the universe, the only planet that has mega flora and fauna, we have a responsibility to enable that to continue. So that would mean ultimately finding a way to get off planet sustainably. So we can take not just ourselves, but life in general off planet. So that gives me another reason to like the idea of growth. Okay? Not in the sense of growing the amount of commodities we consume on this planet, but giving ourselves the capacity ultimately to enable life to continue if we just left it to the natural processes of our solar system.
But isn't it like spiritual growth or like educational growth or something?
No, because you'll die. Okay. Right. Okay. If we the natural life cycle of the sun will wipe our life on this planet in about 500 million years. Okay. We're wiping it out far faster.
Sure.
Okay. So we are actually contradicting the vision of ourselves as intelligent species because we already know this. Okay. Scientists do literally know that the planet will be wiped out by the sun in about 500 million years. Mm-hmm. Okay. We know that well before that happens, life won't be possible here anymore. We know there's a time limit for life on this planet. Mm-hmm. So why aren't we trying to do something about it? Now that needs technology, that means innovation, that means science, but it means respect for life first and foremost. And we are destroying life on the planet at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, like when you read the Club of Rome, this is the German version. I don't have the English version right now, or the IPCC itself. Mm. I mean, they talk about economic growth and that humanity and all the countries need to find an alternative. Like they are very careful with what they say, but they're basically blaming economic growth on the CO2 emissions and all this. So, and as far, like if you take the argument, like as far as we know, we need to use the best solution we have right now. Like we can't wait for like some magical innovation.
Yeah, the innovation are going to come in time.
Or some magical technology in 20, 30 years. I mean, if it comes up, nice, cool. But the responsible thing as human beings would be, okay, as far as we know, these are the best solutions right now.
And they would involve
to sustain life.
Yeah.
So we need to stop growing.
Yep.
Use only clean energy only, and come up with a different kind of market economy or whatever.
And that involves controls. It involves government decisions. It involves collective behaviour.
Well,
none of which
your friends hate that.
Sorry?
Your friends hate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, one reason that people, conventional people like growth is because they can forget about the distribution of income. Okay, if you see, and then literally the answer economists will give all the time is, don't worry about being poor because over time everybody will get richer, and even the poor in future will be rich compared to today. Right. And there's a truth to that, in historical terms. But we can't sustain it with this level of damage we're doing to the biosphere.
Exactly.
So if you're going to try to live within the damage we're doing to the biosphere, you can't. So you say we're going to make the poor feel better off by growth anymore. You've got to make the poor feel better off by redistributing income. Ooh. And that is a total no-no to the economics profession. But that you have to drastically reduce the consumption of the rich. And there's a recent report, the 2024 State of the Planet report, came out a couple of weeks ago. 2024 State of the Planet. The lead author goes by the wonderful name of Ripple, R-I-P-P-L-E. Very easy to find. And they made that case. They said we have to redistribute income, drastically reduce the consumption of the rich. We have to ensure there's sufficient products so that the poor don't die of starvation. We can't rely upon the current income system. If you were to leave the price system right now and you had the trends that they see for food production with global warming leading to potential collapse in crop outputs, the poor will starve to death. Now in that situation, they'll do more than starve, they'll riot. And you'll have a breakdown of civil order. So the only way to maintain the civil order is to guarantee that the poorest in your society can still consume. That means something like universal basic income. It means guaranteeing food access. It means rationing at some point, rationing energy consumption, rationing the lifestyle elements of the wealthy. They have to go.
There's always a running gag almost on this show. Whenever I talk to politicians about inequality, and especially because there's no wealth tax in Germany, about wealth inequality. I mean, you were just talking about income inequality. These are two different things.
Totally, and wealth is far more extreme.
And it's always funny, when I talk about the wealth inequality, which is extreme in Germany, two men in Germany own as much money or capital as the lower 42 million Germans. And when I talk about, what do we do about wealth inequality? The answer is always we need to, income inequality, we need to talk about income and income. And it's always fascinating that they
shy away from wealth.
They shy away from wealth and only want to talk about income distribution and all this. Why is that?
Well, because they're class servants more than they are politicians. They want to they have to maintain the current social system, and that includes the income inequality that's there and the wealth and power that those people have. I mean, most people have no concept of how wealthy the wealthy actually are. I don't, but I've had a bit of exposure to it in the sense that I've been to a few functions with George Soros. Okay. And one of them was a function at the.
I heard he's rich.
He's got a few dollars to spare, and he ran a conference in Paris, about 2016, I think, for which he booked out the Paris Opera House for the dinner at the end, and the meals included gold leaf on the desserts.
Nice.
Now. So I've shat gold at some point in my life. That's just the ostentatiousness of wealth is beyond most people's contemplation. Okay, so you get an enormous income and wealth inequalities in capitalism, but there's every society's had wealth disparities. Okay, and you can largely fit the wealth disparities to what's called a power law. So a tiny fraction has the majority, and the money in the large majority has a tiny fraction. That's a common thing for human societies throughout time. So in that sense, you can say, well, the wealth inequalities part of the system. But what neoliberalism done is put that on steroids. The level of wealth accumulation by the top goes well beyond a parallel distribution. So there is excessive wealth inequality in society.
Especially when you consider that wealth is power or money is power.
Yeah.
This is if that's a true statement in reality, but that's also an anti-democratic thing.
Yeah, your vote counts nothing compared to the power of money, and we don't really live in a democracy.
Why? Because of that.
Because you can get the politicians, the best politicians money can buy, in that sense, and you also get distortion of reality. People are making decisions based on completely fallacious views about how everything functions. The market economy, the myth of neoliberalism is perpetuated. You have myths about science. Most people, not a substantial proportion of the population, don't believe climate change is happening. Okay? The extent to which people are swayed by distorted concepts of reality. And it isn't just that the rich know what's happening and they're bullshitting the poor. The rich bullshit themselves as well. There's a wonderful interview I've just seen broadcast with Rupert Murdoch, where he's fallen for what the economists have said about the impact of global warming. 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees, who cares? Get a bit warmer, you wear one less jumper. That sort of nonsense. Not you go extinct as a species. So we're making incredibly poor decisions. That's why I love the movie Don't Look Up. You've seen Don't Look Up
on Netflix?
Yeah, I mean at one point, my favourite point in the movie is where Jennifer Lawrence's character, who's the one who spotted the comet, is hanging out with a bunch of skateboard riders, and they have talking all the usual conspiracy stuff about the wealthy. And she finally says, guys, the truth is way more depressing. They're not smart enough to be as evil as you give them credit for. And this is what turns up. We live in a whole series of myths about how society functions. But those myths benefit the people at the top of the spectrum, and the politicians aren't about to move away. They're about to challenge. You don't want to challenge Rupert Murdoch, for example. I've seen enough of that in Australia, the extent to which he'll turn politically on an opponent party. And the power they have to influence views, even if the old media is dying, is enormous. So they undermine. The political viability depends upon sucking up to the rich.
It's always whenever there's like a election campaign in Germany or other in other countries, they're always we're going to be the democratic alternative, and then we have to fight fascism or the right-wing extremists in France, in Germany, now in the US. And those Democrats who fight for democracy don't want to touch wealth and income.
Yeah.
Inequality.
Yeah.
Although that's what they should be doing, because that could be, the inequality could be or is a cause of the rise of fascism.
Yeah.
I mean, you know Horkheimer, right?
Who?
Horkheimer, the German philosopher, a Jewish philosopher.
I don't actually.
He said, whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also be keep quiet about fascism.
Yeah, because, and I saw a little argument about this today, that the rise of fascism is normally due to the working class getting screwed. And they then think we're being screwed by the so-called, ones with our interests at heart. I just want to eat. And Hitler promised me food. And the reality, a lot of that, the rise of fascism in the 1930s was due to the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And the people who suffer from the Great Depression, well, everybody suffered, but the workers in particular, no unemployment benefits. The appeal of communism was pretty high in America in the 1930s, but so was the appeal of fascism. There were fascist rallies in Madison Square Garden in New York City. So
nowadays there's no appeal to socialism or communism.
That's gone, yeah.
But there's the appeal of fascism or the status quo.
Yeah. And the status.
So we're in a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I think I don't think we're going to turn around until we see climate catastrophes that literally terrify people.
But when these catastrophes happen, it's too late.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, Bernie Sanders said on your share a few months back,
yeah,
and he repeated his phrase that the billionaires should not exist at all. Like we were talking about inequality and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the minimum wage. Should there be like a cap on wealth?
Well, there's one of the interesting experiments, social experiments of the world, is the Mondragon cooperative in Spain. Are you aware of Mondragon?
I'm aware.
Okay.
We haven't done a show on it, but
I'm
aware.
And because it was founded by a Catholic priest in a very depressed area of Spain after the Civil War, before the Second World, while the Second War was still happening, I think. And he's brought a whole lot of sort of ethical principles from the good side of the Catholic Church into operation there. And one of the rules was set that the top income earner, first of all corporations are cooperatives. They weren't capitalists. You weren't owned by an individual. They were owned by the workers in the factory. And secondly, the maximum salary, I think, in a Mondragon cooperative was 6 times the minimum. So you had an income range set. You couldn't accumulate a lot of wealth in that situation.
Right.
You still got paid 6 times better than the janitor if you were the CEO. But a whole lot of rules were there to stop accumulation and stop those extremes while still encouraging the workers to innovate, because if you come up with new ideas, you benefit. So it's possible to have a system which gives you those stimuli for innovation but doesn't give you the outrageous returns. And like often you'll see some of the most important innovations, like the integrated circuit, was invented by, I think, employees at Hewlett-Packard. I think it was Hewlett-Packard. And they didn't really benefit. They shockingly got the Nobel Prize and apparently was not the main contributor from what I've seen in the science literature. But the idea was, a few employees who got a bit of a bonus came up with the idea. The corporation earned an enormous amount of money out of it. But if you'd had this Mondragon style, then maybe Shockley and co. would have got a damn sight more money for it than they got out of the capitalist system when they were actually the innovators. So you want those innovations to happen. You want a certain reward for it, but you don't necessarily want the billion-dollar rewards that apply in modern civilization.
But we want innovation and technological innovation. The argument always seems to be, without capitalism, there's no innovation, or without profit, there's no innovation. Is that like
the strongest argument for capitalism is innovation?
But there was before there was capitalism, there was human innovation as well. I mean,
there was some crazy elements, like for example the Chinese feudal system apparently invented gunpowder, 1,000 years before it came out in the West. I think the West actually stole the idea. Never used it for arms. It was basically used for fireworks, which is a much better use than arms in some ways. But a whole lot of innovations occurred and then died out. Capitalism gives you that stimulus that if you come up with a new idea and you make a fortune out of it, and that drives you to persist in doing it. So there's an argument, the incentive argument there makes a certain amount of sense. But do you need the level of stimulus that capitalism gives you? Like I'm in a weird situation myself. I've invented a new software package, which is I want to make commercial, and one of the motivations is the ridiculous amount of money that I could get if I could sell the IP or sell enough copies of the software. And the motivation is ridiculous. The market that this thing sells into is worth $40 billion a year. So the stimulus there, okay, let's make part of that, let's get some of that $40 billion. But it'd be possible to do it for a damn sight less than that reward. You don't need that level of inequality that capitalism gives you the possibility for.
I mean there could be how about like a limit? I remember
that 6 times limit in Mondragon.
Yeah, we were talking about COVID. I mean, I'm all for the guy who invented the COVID vaccine, like this
mRNAs.
The BioNTech in Germany. I mean, let him profit from that invention, but maybe put a cap on it. Make 5 times over what you
5 or 50, but not 50,000.
For 2 years or something, profit from it, and then it goes to
And instead what we've had is
publishers.
extending all that. So have you heard of what's called the Mickey Mouse Amendment?
No.
Okay. Copyright in America used to last 25 years. And what that meant was you invent something and you get a benefit from for 25 years, which is quite a while. Then Walt Disney invented Mickey Mouse, the cartoon character Mickey Mouse. And every time you approached the 25-year point, lobbying was done by Walt Disney and a whole lot of others to extend the limit. So in 25, 35, I think it's now 75 years. Now, that means somebody is entitled to benefit from their invention for 25 years longer than they're likely to live. You're not going to come up with an idea like when you're 20, anything under 25 years old. Pardon me. So you're going to go 100 years benefiting from an idea you had when you were 25 years old. It's crazy. It's gone too far.
Maybe have a drink.
There's a bit of a tickle in my throat. So there are reasons. There's no market reason that you should get an infinite period of return from an invention.
No.
Equally, there's no reason you should get no return whatsoever. You need a balance between the two. But because the wealthy get to write the rules and write their laws and lobby the politicians and so on, we've extended that too far. I think we should have the rule of patents lasting 25 years. That was what they used to be 100 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, 25 years is a reasonable length of time. Okay? You come up with a great idea, you've got the exclusive right to it for 25 years, then it's public domain.
Sounds reasonable.
Instead we're doing 75 years.
Great. Since we talked about the existence of billionaires, and Bernie was talking about the threat to democracy as well. And there was a question in our forum. This guy wanted to ask you, why do so many economists still believe that we can have democracy and capitalism at the same time? Like there's like people are like, oh, if you're against capitalism, so you're against democracy, because that's...
Yeah, they're not coextensive.
No.
Like I think what we mean by democracy, I think is anti-democratic, because what demos means the people, the people rule. And when you look at what happens now, we get political classes instead, and political elites that benefit from supporting the wealthy. And you basically have rivalry, one political group versus another, Republican versus Democrat in America, that sort of thing. If you look back at what the Greeks actually did, it wasn't universal. We think we come, carrying on from the Greek democracy. And there were elections in Greece, but the main thing was they used sortition. And the idea was you would have a random number process. That means you would select intelligent people, okay, not anybody at all, but intelligent people to become part of the leading group of society. So they had sortition. You'd ask a bunch of wealthy top families to nominate people, and then they'd be asked to nominate, and they'd nominate, and they'd nominate. And the way it went was it meant the initial people, the wealthy, realised that there's no way they could control the process all the way through. So they'd nominate sensible people rather than people who are sycophants of theirs in the second round, and then the next thing would happen the same way. So a lot of important officials were selected that way. Okay, so you ended up having people carrying out public roles who were chosen for their intelligence and their sense of community. Now instead, you look at Boris Bloody Johnson, Donald Trump. I don't know who you've got here at the moment, but you get narcissists. We have a political system that selects for narcissism on both sides of the aisle.
Friedrich Merz.
Huh?
That's what he's called here.
Okay.
Friedrich Merz. Yeah. But yeah.
So our political system is a farce. And then it's dominated by money at the same time. Like when I made the mistake of accepting a political party's request that I run for office in Australia, the thing that stopped us, we didn't have any money to campaign.
Well, you
need money. Now, if you wanted to...
That's anti-democratic in a way as well. Like if your ability to campaign is based on your ability to make or create funds for it.
So one of the best arguments for government funding is to government fund in as politically neutral a way as possible political parties. Okay? So if you have a certain representation in the parliament now, then you get a fraction of the government money dedicated for campaigning. You'd need some system, which I haven't worked out, for new parties.
It kind of works like this, like that here.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a better thing about your politics.
Well, we still have problems, of course.
Yeah. But like, look at America.
The parties are able to accept, money from donations from billionaires or companies and all that. So
Australia has a similar system in the sense that after a certain level of votes, then you get payment for campaigning for the number of your percentage of the vote that you acquire. That's a good bit, but the same story. Mm-hmm. You can raise money for political campaigning. It shouldn't be possible. There should be a ban on political donations of money to political parties because you're basically buying their opinions.
We need incentives, Steve.
We need disincentives.
Back to the growth aspect of our discussions. Do you think at some point we will come up with some some system where growth is not necessary? I mean, nobody's against growth per se, but we need to find an economic system where we don't need growth, like in capitalism.
Yeah, I mean,
is that thinkable? Do people think about it?
What you want, as an ideal situation, is a system that meant everybody gets enough to live a comfortable life. Oh. Okay, that's your.
That sounds like communism,
ideal.
Steve.
It sounds like communism, doesn't it? And what that comfortable life has meant really is consuming more energy per head. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's always the temptation of more energy. Okay, going faster, fancier accommodation.
If it's clean energy, why not?
Well, the trouble is, at a certain point, we can't continue consuming energy at that rate on this planet. This is, again, we need the understanding that scientists have. So one of my favorite guys is, I can't give Tom's last name now, which is pissing me off, but Tom Murphy, a physicist, and he ran a blog called Do the Math, and he became quite a skeptic of economics by doing the blog, and then one day found himself sitting next to a prominent economist at a dinner and decided to grill the guy and see what he knew about energy. Of course, he knew bugger all. But he asked you, do you think growth can go on indefinitely? Mm-hmm. And then he pointed out the dependence of growth upon energy and said that if you have an annual rate of growth of consumption of 2.3% per annum, that means over a century you increase your consumption of energy by a factor of 10. So 1 century gives you 10 times.
1,000%.
2 gives you 100.
Oh.
Okay. 3 is the 1,000. 4 is 10,000. Okay.
Wow.
That's the danger of exponential growth. Now, what he said, if at the moment the damage we're doing to the planet is by carbon dioxide, and we're insulating the planet, so we're retaining more of the sun's heat. The actual amount of heat we're pumping out is quite trivial. Because that if you keep that process going on for 400 years, at 400 years, I think there might be more than, I'm not sure the actual number of years, but it's something like between 400 to 1,000 years, the waste heat alone, according to the second law of thermodynamics, on this planet would mean the temperature of the planet rose to 100 degrees Celsius. Obviously, that is impossible. Mm-hmm. Okay? So there's a limit to growth simply out of the laws of thermodynamics of energy consumption on this planet. Now, that's something economists are completely unaware of. So that gives you a limit to how much you can grow on this biosphere.
I mean, what I proposed to you was like this clean capital, those green capitalism fantasies.
Even that would get there.
We keep capitalism going, just with solar and wind energy
and nuclear
in some countries, sure.
I know it's a difficult one in Germany, but even that, if we continue trying to grow, so everybody gets a higher standard of living per year, we all grow at 2.3% per annum. Mm-hmm. That leads to catastrophe in about 4 centuries. So the only way we can do this, and this is going to make me sound like a space cadet, but I'm going to wear it, we have to take production off planet. If we want to continue growing, we have to take it off planet. Even there are limits. Tom does a beautiful job of showing that if you continue that 2.3% per annum, at some point you're using all the energy of the galaxy, which is simply impossible.
Wow.
Within finite time. Okay, the exponential growth means you reach ridiculous numbers in finite time. Okay, double every. If you increase by a factor of 10 every century, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000.
Maybe that's why Elon wants to go to Mars.
Huh?
Maybe that's why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars.
I think it's a damn good idea. I think we should. And again, you don't need economic growth, but you need technological growth to get there. So that's what I'm trying to differentiate.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to stop economic growth and continue technological growth.
I'm all for it.
Not exactly politically easy to achieve, though, unfortunately. And I think we're only going to start considering it when we start seeing truly horrific climate catastrophes. And then, as you say, by that point, it may be too late to change direction.
I mean, when it comes to energy, the hot topic right now is artificial intelligence, AI. I mean, if you actually read some journals, everybody's going crazy because this AI is like costing us so much energy consumption. Again. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Like what ChatGPT and all this, they're using amazing amounts of energy. What would Karl Marx say to companies trying to establish, or making AI a thing? Is it because, like, if I were a capitalist, I would tell you, Steve, AI is great for humanity. It's going to make our life easier. That's what I would tell you.
Yeah.
But as a capitalist, I would think I can lower my labor costs.
Yeah.
I own.
I'm actually wondering whether AI is going to be like a bubble that bursts at some point, because the costs are huge.
Yeah.
I mean, the data systems, the GPUs you've got to have, the cooling costs, they're enormous. I believe Microsoft is about to restart the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor simply to power its AI system.
Yeah.
It's enormously energy intensive.
OpenAI makes billions. They lose billions of dollars.
Yeah, so I've got a feeling it's going to be a bubble that bursts, because you can do some creative stuff with it. I mean, there's some areas where AI makes absolute sense, like diagnostic principles, for example, working out what disease you might have.
But now we have the situation that at least in Germany and in Europe, the government is subsidizing the research and the making AI better. While at the same time, the companies who try to make AI a thing sell it to other companies so they can lower the labor costs. It's not for the benefit of the society.
No,
it's for the benefit of the companies.
I mean, I just think it's still a bubble. The costs are huge,
right?
And they haven't worked out a way of making profit out of it yet. Now, if you could replace back office staff dramatically using AI, I think actually robotics is more interesting for replacing labour than AI. I think AI is it'll work in some fields, like language. You wouldn't want to go to a job as a translator anymore. That's something AI can obviously take over.
Yeah.
So it's going to wipe out the job of being a translator.
Yeah.
And it'll do a extremely good job 99.9% of the time.
Sure.
So there are areas where it makes plenty of sense. But I think the promises are being massively oversold. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about how long AI is going to last. What you're likely to see is that we go through a bubble and burst in the overall investment in AI, and then it'll decline to a range of areas where it makes sense, like self-driving cars and things like that. That makes sense as an application of AI. Translation itself, there are certainly points where it works, but the amount of infrastructure going into right now, I think, is bubble territory.
I mean, especially the idea of using AI for self-driving cars is actually a great idea, because then we wouldn't need as much cars on the roads, because if you only have the system of self-driving cars,
the cars will be driving 24 hours.
Exactly, and in Germany at least, there's a saying like your car is parked 23 hours a day.
Yeah.
So
It's unused.
You eliminate the unused cars.
And that means so it makes there are ways in which it works. Okay.
Sure.
So I'm not a complete skeptic of the whole area.
But the companies sell AI like, oh, you can create a picture by...
And I tried that. You ever tried making a picture in AI?
Yeah.
I had a cartoon I wanted to send up about global warming, and the idea was to have a captain on a boat ignoring all the protests from the passengers about ice. Watch out, there's too much ice ahead. And he's saying, you bloody iceberg believers, we haven't seen any ice, hasn't been anything to worry about yet. So there's an iceberg. And I tried to get the bloody thing to get the picture, and it gave me numerous variations, none of which worked. So it isn't artificial intelligence. So, the actual term is large language models.
Yeah.
And the matrix transformations, and they basically predict the most likely next word or the most likely variation. But the capacity to fine-tune it and get it down to what you want, it probably will get there. And it then means, cartoonists might not have jobs anymore. But to me, I think they're overselling what they can do.
Well, especially when the costs are huge. But then again,
if
they ask the government to cover their ass,
which they're doing.
Subsidies.
But you've also got the issue of once we realise just how dangerous it is to have a level of energy consumption we're doing, what are the easiest areas to shut down? And one of them is going to be AI. Another will probably be Bitcoin. A third would be international travel. If you actually realise, holy shit, we're in a serious strife here, we've got to reduce energy consumption, it's one of the most fragile areas.
We don't ban things.
Well, I think that's going to change. I think that's going to change. Too late? Okay.
I'm sure there are one or two Bitcoin bros in the chat.
I'm sure there will be.
Watching us right now. Do you want to make yourself popular with them? Talking about Bitcoin and crypto?
There's two things about crypto. The way Bitcoin is defined, it's not money. Okay. The nature of money, Bitcoin doesn't really fit the nature of money. A large part of it is people want it to appreciate in value. So if it appreciates in value, the last thing you want to use it for is transactions. Who was some guy who bought a pizza with 100 Bitcoin, 20 years ago? You could buy a pizza company with the same number of Bitcoins these days. It encourages you not to do transactions. So it defeats one of the purposes of money, which is to encourage transactions. So that's part of the flaw. Also, I should have bought Bitcoin. Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert tried to persuade me to buy some, and I should have bought 1,000 quid's worth. I could have afforded to lose 1,000 quid. I'd be worth a couple of million, tens of millions by now if I'd done it. Big mistake by me, got to say. But I've always seen the energy consumption issue. Proof of stake or proof of work, I've forgotten which one they call it. But that to me is the fall down. The amount of energy it takes, when that was explained to me, they've got to basically burn 10 minutes of processing power of all the various competing types trying to get the next nonce out. I thought that was just ridiculous. The energy issue, I thought would bring it unstuck, and it still probably will. That's Bitcoin. There are plenty of other ones that are using a different form which uses less energy. But to me, that the weakness was the dependence upon huge amounts of energy. And the same thing applies to AI.
It always comes back to energy.
And that's the blind spot of economists. So they'll never see the problems they're causing. And they'll never see what they depend upon. And that's why I found this Susskind book quite remarkable. What it lacked, what it didn't have was just ridiculous.
I mean, what we've been talking about for more than 2 hours is like a cult.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember that there was a video that I saw from you. Like, did you explain the neoclassical economists that it's one form of a cult?
Yeah, and part of the reason is because humanity has always been attracted to ideal systems. I don't see us as critical thinkers so much as people who share beliefs. Humans have always shared beliefs, and we try to convert other people to our beliefs. And our beliefs are so important, we'll bloody well die for them. And there's an element to that in science in general. Again, astronomy rose out of trying to explain the beauty of God's creation. And so the idea that the earth was the center of the universe and God put us there, et cetera, et cetera. But science developed the practice of testing hypotheses with experiments. And the experiments in science are eternal. Once you've found that the blackbody radiation experiment fails, Maxwell's theory can't explain it. That it's always there for anybody to find. When you do the Michelson-Morley experiment, you find there is no ether. That theory has to go at some point. Economic crises are transient. You can forget about the Great Depression. You can forget about the inflation of the 70s, et cetera, et cetera. So that process of generational change doesn't occur. But what sticks with it is this belief in a perfect system. And I've had my favourite personal experience of that was I organised a conference. I used to run conferences between business groups and unions in Australia, a government body. And we were trying to bring out a form of Swedish social democracy, which we got completely undercut by economists and Treasury, who blocked us every step of the way. But I had one conference in the food industry where I had the trade unions and the manufacturers, and I brought along an economist whose job it was to set tariffs. And he was attacked by both sides, really quite devastating, at a isolated country retreat where there was no telephones and you couldn't get away. And he was sitting at the bar afterwards looking in complete shock. And I felt a bit sorry for him, so I went up and had a bit of a chat with him. And he finally said over a beer, "Look, you're an economist. Help me convert these people." Convert. It was religious terminology. And they do believe they understand what is the perfect system, and they're trying to convert the rest of us to do it. But their vision of the system is a completely inadequate description of reality. And it's like having a religious cult in charge of economic policy.
And the most dangerous cult is the one that doesn't realize it.
Yeah, exactly. When you don't realize you're in your cult, you're far more dangerous than if you do.
But I mean, the problem that we keep coming back to is their blind spot. The blind spot is energy.
One of them, that's the most important one. Money's another blind spot.
Another blind spot.
Oh, yeah. Their theories of money are nonsense.
Okay. Go on.
Okay. They've got a theory of money which basically sees money as a commodity, like a wheat. Okay. And you therefore, when you put money in a bank, it's like putting wheat in a warehouse. Okay. And then if anybody wants to use that wheat, they've got to take it out and then put it back in again. This is called the model of loanable funds.
Okay.
Now, that underlies their arguments about why you shouldn't have large amounts of government spending. Because if the government borrows the wheat, then it's not there for the firms to use and you get less GDP. Okay? And therefore, they are always trying to cut government spending. But if you look at the real world, money is not a commodity. Money is a promise. Okay? A promise by banks to give you what have you put in as deposits back, a promise by government in the form of bank notes and things like that. And so promises can be created. And that's what banks do. Banks create money by saying we're going to, here's €1 million to go and buy that house in Berlin, and you owe us €1 million. So the process of creating a loan creates money. And that's been something which has been known by non-orthodox economists for a century now. And neoclassicals continue refusing to accept it. And
that's why they hate MMT and all this?
That's one of the reasons they hate MMT, yeah. But they hate more than just MMT, okay? But they hate what's called endogenous money theory as well. So the endogenous money theory says banks create money. Okay? Banks don't take in deposits and lend them out. Banks create money. Right. Now, the Bank of England actually came out and agreed with the heretics in 2014. The Bundesbank did in 2017.
Really?
Yeah. So you can find a paper by the Bundesbank saying money is obviously created by double entry bookkeeping accounting processes. Banks create money. Okay.
Our finance minister, Mr. Christian Lindner, says there's only money from the taxpayer. There's only taxpayer money.
Oh, bloody hell. Well, there's no such thing as taxpayer money, and there's money created by governments and money created by banks. They both are money creation systems.
He's been lying to us for the last.
He doesn't know.
Oh.
Yeah? When they swallow this stuff at university, they believe it's the real world. And I've had experience with trying to persuade. I stopped myself. Persuade them that they're wrong. Okay, and what the funniest was there's a guy called George Selgin, I think his name is, who works for the Cato Institute, which is quite a conservative think tank, American think tank. He's actually based in Portugal these days. But he came out attacking the idea that banks create money. And he did a fairly careful exposition of his case. And part of what he was doing is saying, I'm going to make a set of assumptions to simplify the argument. And one of the assumptions he made was cash doesn't exist. I thought, okay, I'm happy to wear that as a simplification because cash is printed. You know, you make it on a printing press. So he's leaving out the possibility of physical cash. So I'm going to assume all money is deposit accounts. Okay, and he also assumed away the existence of term deposits. So if you make a deposit into your bank account, that's a demand deposit. If you put €1,000 into your bank and then you want to draw it out, you can draw it out seconds later. Okay, demand deposit. Term deposit, you put it in, you can't take it out. Now the bank, if the bank lent your demand deposit, you'd be outraged. You put €1,000 in the bank, you find they've given 500 to somebody else, you'd be on the warpath, and rightly so. Yeah. Put it in a term deposit, they can do that. You know that's the situation. So banks can lend term deposits, but they can't lend demand deposits. Now Selgin said, I'm going to ignore term deposits. Now, when I wrote my reply to him, I said, okay, here's these assumptions he made. I said, and they're quite reasonable. For the argument he's trying to have here, he's clarifying this argument by leaving out these various elements of reality. Then I read his reply to me, and he was outraged that I said he assumed term deposits don't exist. Of course I know term deposits exist. And I thought, what the fuck are you doing? Because I can say fuck, can't I?
Yeah, sure.
Good, okay. What the fuck are you doing? Because, you know, I'm saying this is a good assumption. But he just looked for something to get angry at, got angry at that, and then didn't read the rest of what I wrote. Okay, so
sounds like Twitter, a troll.
Yeah, worse than Twitter. But that's what they do. So if you put forward an argument which rejects part of their concept, so the banks have taken deposits and lend them out again. That's what they teach in the textbooks. If you come along and say that's wrong, they don't want to assess your argument. They want to find a right way to reject it out of hand. So that's what they do. So the Bundesbank comes out and says banks create money. The Bank of England says the same beforehand. The Norwegian central bank has said it, the New Zealand central bank. You know, it takes a lot for those banks like that to break from the orthodoxy of economics. So I was stunned when they did it, and I thought, surely the orthodoxy can't continue on with this model now. But they have. They still teach that banks lend out deposits, and they gave the Nobel Prize to Bernanke in 2022 for papers assuming loanable funds. So they refuse to acknowledge the obvious elements of reality, such as the role of energy in production, such as the fact that banks create money and governments create money. And then they get the right to manage the economy. Well, they mismanage it.
Why is there a reserve currency? Or why are
you
there
mean
reserve
like American
currency?
dollar?
Yeah, like the American dollar.
Because we had a stuff up at Bretton Woods. Because at Bretton Woods, Keynes wanted to have an international currency created called the Bancor, which would basically be like an overdraft account. So if you wanted to, you had German marks and you wanted to buy an American product, you'd need to convert the German marks into Bancor and do the exchange of Bancor at the International Monetary Fund, a clearinghouse is what it was going to be.
Right.
And then the Bancor would be converted into American dollars to buy the goods. And the way it was set up, Bancor would not actually be a currency. It would be literally every country would start with zero Bancor. Okay, and the thing is, you go to negative. Okay, so if you had a country which was importing more than it was exporting, it'd get a negative balance. Countries exporting more than import, get a positive balance. Okay. At some point, you're running too large a negative balance, you were forced to devalue. But if you ran a positive balance, you also forced to pay interest on the positive balance, and the interest went to developing countries. Okay,
Germany would hate that.
Huh?
Germany would hate that.
I'm sure. But it wasn't the Germans that shot it down. They weren't in a position to shoot anything down after 45. This is 44, of course, in Bretton Woods. And Harry Dexter White, who was the American representative there, opposed Keynes's idea, and he wanted effectively the American dollar to replace the British pound. Because before the First World War, the British pound was the currency for international trade, and Dexter White wanted the American dollar to be so that's why we got it. The Americans were the most powerful force at Bretton Woods. Keynes was talking about an international currency. That got overruled, and we got the American dollar and the gold standard and all that nonsense instead.
But doesn't that make the U.S. automatically more powerful than all the rest?
It also weakens them at the same time.
Why?
Because because we have the American dollar for international commerce and for international finance, which is more important in terms of volume, you have a demand for American dollars over and above demand for dollars to buy American goods, which means you get a higher exchange rate for the American dollar, which means American manufacturing finds it harder to compete with the rest of the world. So it undermines the manufacturing system. It's actually called the Dutch disease.
I never heard that.
Huh?
I never heard of
That's
the Dutch.
because the Dutch, I've forgotten which resources it was, but a huge resource sector undermines the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. But here with the Americans, the fact that it's international currency means that American manufacturing is uncompetitive.
Why doesn't the U.S. change that?
Because the finance sector dominates America. The finance sector does very well out of that. Like initially, American manufacturers would have been gung-ho about it. We're the most powerful country on the planet. People have got to buy in our currency. I can see how they would have fallen for the ideology of it. But the overall economic effect is the American dollar is overvalued. Therefore, American manufacturing is less competitive. So sensibly, you would have wanted Keynes's proposal to prevent that happening, but instead we went with Dexter White's instead. And I think that's a large part of why we've got such a stuffed up global economic system, is because the American dollar is used for international trade.
You mentioned the Deutsche Mark.
Yeah.
We have the euro now.
Oh, yeah.
Steve, how awesome is the euro currency?
I've been an opponent of the euro since it was first invented.
Why?
Because it means that countries have given up the right to have their own currency. Okay.
Consider the European Union a country, Steve.
If it was, it'd be fine. You'd have a national government.
We don't.
Okay. You'd have states. You don't.
No.
Okay. This is one of the things which you get agreement between the most conservative and the most radical economists at one go. Milton Friedman was an opponent of the euro. He said because Europe doesn't have the precursors that America had to have a single currency and a single national system, because there's such differences between different countries in Europe, far more so than there are states in America. You didn't have states issuing their own currency. You had that for a while in the early revolutionary days, but generally speaking, it was only ever one currency. Like the whole reason for forming the European Union was to give Europe the capacity to compete against America by having a continental economy. And you had that fine with the ECU system. You had the national currencies and an internal exchange rate system. That was sufficient. And it then meant you could have different macro policies in different countries in Europe for different circumstances. And you could also run deficits. Okay, you could create money because the government deficit creates money.
Right.
Now, the whole ordo-liberal thing that is behind the euro is to stop the government doing that. And so they see government debt as the most dangerous form of debt, when in fact private debt is the dangerous form of debt. So that whole, the Maastricht Treaty, I think, I've actually described it once as a suicide note for the European economy.
So it's like a ticking time bomb? Or do we need like the political union and fiscal union and then...
The only way it would work would be complete fiscal union. But you're never going to achieve that. There's too much political rivalry and differences between states, countries in Europe. far more so than states in America. And I think what you should have done is have use the euro for international trade, and then have the central banks in every country doing a one-for-one exchange. Not for one obviously between the mark and the lira, but meaning you lost absolutely no money when you exchange lira for marks. Okay, do it at zero cost, and then enable international transactions to be done using like a euro as a internal unit of account, but still allow Italy to create its own money, Germany to create its own money. That's what should have happened.
But who came up with the idea of a euro? The euro we have nowadays, with no nation state, with no fiscal union.
The Schnabels. Is it not Schnabel, pardon me. I can't think of the name. The ex-German chancellor.
Schäuble? No.
No?
Schäuble? No.
I think so.
But wasn't the euro invented in the 80s or 90s or something?
The euro began in 1999. It began in 2001 as an actual currency.
But this is like nothing. These are no news, what you just said about the problems of the euro system. But couldn't the people who invented that, I mean, they wanted to make European competitive and better than other states.
And that was like the idea of having
like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, the trouble is it combined with stupid theories of money.
Okay.
Because this is like their theory that the government, the ordo-liberals, the particular like a marriage of Austrian and neoclassical economics, they thought all the trouble was caused by too much government spending. So they wanted to constrain government spending and deficits no more than 3% of GDP, government debt no more than 60% of GDP. And what that meant was you cut off the capacity of the government to create money. So you're left only with private money creation. And that leads to bubbles and crashes. That was a huge part of Spain's boom and bust from 2000 to 2010. They're trying to control government money creation, ignoring private money creation. You got something that hobbled most of the economies of Europe. It's incredibly convenient. I mean, I've got euro in my pocket. I can go and shop I just get off the plane and buy with the stuff. It's very convenient, and I can understand the appeal of the euro as a form of currency. But you could have emulated the same thing by saying we will guarantee 100% conversion of any European currency into any other European currency at zero cost to the transactor. And then bang, you could have the international travel that's an essential part of Europe today, and have a potential for companies to span European countries as well. So you didn't have to bring in the euro, a single currency, and you certainly didn't have to limit the capacity of governments to create money, which is what you've done with the Maastricht Treaty. So I see that as incredibly destructive for Europe.
So it's funny that you say like these economists that we've been talking about for 2.5 hours now, and when we're going to come to a close in a few minutes. But you need to come back at some point. I'm just saying, like Steve hasn't been. You're not flying in from Australia. You live in.
Unfortunately, I've got to fly from Amsterdam. I'd far rather get the train, but getting the train to Berlin is bloody impossible.
Well, but you've not been coming here from Sydney.
No, that's right. I'm just from Amsterdam. Yeah.
But like these economists that we've been talking about, like they never say, "Oh, we need to cut government spending," Steve, because that sounds like unsocial. Like
well, that sounds instead.
This sounds bad. In Germany, at least, they say we need to watch the deficit.
Yeah.
There can't be a deficit.
And the trouble is they think the deficit means they're borrowing off the private sector. And when you look at the actual accounting of it, and that's I invented this package Ravel, part of what it does is enable you to do large-scale accounting. The government doesn't borrow off the private sector when it runs a deficit. It creates money for the private sector when it runs a deficit. So by trying to restrain the deficit, you're restraining money creation, where the money that's created that way doesn't involve a debt for the individual receiving it. If you borrow money from a bank, you get €1 million, you owe the bank €1 million. You're no better off financially Okay, but you've got much spending power, but you've got a debt at the same time. When the government spends €1 million more than it takes back in taxation, you've got €1 million which has no debt attached to it for you. So a government deficit creates money for the private sector. It doesn't take it from the private sector. And the way they do the accounting, they think it takes it from the private sector and therefore leads to less investment and less growth. In fact, the opposite is the truth.
I always try to call their bluff when they say it's about the deficit, because you can call them out on, like, why don't you call for higher taxes on billionaires, millionaires, so the government
to reduce the deficit.
Yeah, reduce the deficit through
taxation.
Taxation.
I can't do that.
No, they can't do that. That hurts growth.
Can't do the same old thing again.
Can't do that, or the rich are leaving the country or something like that.
Yeah. I've just done a blog post where I took their view of how money is created and why a deficit is a bad idea, and that's set up the accounting structure to look like the government borrows from the household sector. Okay, and it leads to all the terrible catastrophes they think are going to happen. Then in a couple of minutes, I changed the structure of the model. So no, the government doesn't borrow from the private sector. It sells bonds to the banks, okay? And the household sector doesn't lend to the firms. The firms borrow from banks. Just change the structure so it actually fits the real accounting. Totally different world. The deficit actually causes more economic growth, not less.
So we covered two blind spots: energy
and money.
And money. Are there more blind spots? Or
well, they've got a blind spot over competition itself, how firms actually operate. They've got a blind spot over the fundamental strength of capitalism is diversity and evolution of products over time. They've got a blind spot over that. Equilibrium is a blind spot to evolution.
Because equilibrium doesn't exist.
Yeah. And if you had if you had equilibrium, you wouldn't have evolution. There wouldn't be change over time.
Right.
So they've got a completely false model of capitalism.
Like back to your days as a young guy at the university. Back in the 70s, there was the West, the capitalistic West, the communistic East.
Yeah.
Did you learn, or were you taught why capitalism is the best system? Or why communism is bad?
I had some great teachers, so I learned a lot of history of economic thought. A guy called Ted Wheelwright was incredibly important to me. But I also decided to read as broadly as I could. So like one thing I decided, having all this negative stuff about Stalin, maybe I should read something written by Stalin.
Oh.
So I found a book called The Problems of Communism by Joseph Stalin. Right. And read it, and most of the way through was quite a reasonable, detailed description of Russian industry and so on. Quite reasonable. I'll never forget when I got to one particular line, and it's suddenly his personality comes through. He says, all the preceding is meaningless. Russian industry is progressing in leaps and bounds. Anyone who does not believe this is a sworn enemy of the Soviet people. And I thought, holy shit, if I was a statistician somewhere in the Urals about to report a fall in agricultural output, I'd read that line and think, shit, if I say there's a negative here, I'm going to get killed. Yep. I'm going to change that minus to a plus. So I am aware of the problems of communism. I also I've never met him, which is a mistake of mine. I should have got in touch with him personally. János Kornai, who's a Hungarian economist who did the best work on why communism failed as a system. And he talked about what he called resource-constrained versus demand-constrained economies and how resource-constrained economies grow more sluggishly and demand-constrained economies grow with more volatility but innovate more. And he said socialism is resource-constrained and capitalism is demand-constrained. But in fact, the neoclassical model of the economy is like the Russian economy, where it's resource constraints that stop you. They've got the wrong model.
You should argue that with them.
There's no point arguing with them. They're lost. They've gone down the rabbit hole. Once somebody's swallowed that stuff, they've got to go through an epiphany to have any reversal. You can't persuade them. So I'm just trying to convince young people that there's a different way to think about capitalism.
Maybe Rudi is watching and
I hope so. Let's wait and
getting his
see.
epiphany. Hi, Rudi. We were talking about you earlier. But do you have like a political ideology? You sound like like a democratic socialist or something.
I'm definitely progressive left in my politics.
Yeah.
But my ultimate feeling is the only way we're going to survive as a civilization is to see our main role in enhancing life, the capacity for life on the planet. So that's my ultimate ideology. But in terms of the economics I'm building, I'm trying to build a approach to economics which is ideology free, and it's actually possible to do that.
Could you briefly explain, because like when people, at least in Germany or in Europe, hear that you're a proponent of leaving the European Union, you're called a right-winger.
Oh yeah, okay.
And you were famously pro-Brexit.
No, I wasn't.
You wasn't?
No.
You were?
Australia has this political system that lets you do a protest vote.
Okay.
I didn't like the European Union because of the Maastricht Treaty.
Okay.
And I was reading the polls, and the polls were saying the vote for Brexit is going to lose.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, I'm going to vote for it because I want to send a negative message to the European Union. You know, come so close, you almost lost, you better change your policies. Woke up the next morning and saw the damn thing had won. I thought, oh, shit. So I didn't even think about that. If I was asked for the economic consequences for the Britain of actually leaving the euro, you're leaving the common market. You already have, you don't have to have, you've got, the only member of the common market has its own currency. So that'd be bad. If I was economically alone and assessing should the England leave the European Union, I said, no, you shouldn't. Brexit would be a bad idea. But I thought it'd be a nice kick in the balls. It'd fail. All the polls were saying it was going to fail. But, I want a good, strong kick in the balls for Brussels. That's what I wanted. Then it won.
Are you a British citizen?
No.
But how can you vote then?
Because I was a British resident at the time.
Oh, and then you were like...
you're able to vote, yeah. Oh. But like, I woke up and think, oh, Jesus. And like Cameron did resign the next day. Cameron, the only reason he called the vote was to try to wipe out the right-wingers. Yeah. And instead they bloody well won. So it was a catastrophe all round. There's been a catastrophe ever since. So I voted for it as a kick in the balls for the European Union. If I'd known it was actually going to win, I wouldn't have got out of bed.
But that's a pretty dumb reason to vote.
I know, but in Australia, we have a preferential voting system. Okay? So I always end up voting for the Labor Party ahead of the Conservatives, known as the Liberal Party. But I vote for every other party beforehand. Like when I put the vote, the last time I voted in Australia, my first vote was for the Sex Party. Second was for the Greens.
The Sex Party?
There's a Sex Party. Okay, they wanted to liberalise something about sex. I've forgotten what it was. Right. Sex Party, Greens. There's a Communist Party. I voted for that. Then the Labor Party, and then the Liberal Party, which was the Conservatives, and then Fred Nile, who was a religious extremist. So when you do that, you know your first vote's not going to win. Sex Party is not, pardon me the pun, the Sex Party is not going to get up. Okay. Then you know the Greens aren't going to win, the Communists aren't going to win. The Labor Party, what happens, your vote gets allocated. So it goes, Sex Party doesn't get it, his second vote was for the Greens, we give it to the Greens. The Greens don't get it, his third vote for the Communists goes to the Communists. The Communists don't get it, his fourth vote is for the Labor Party. The Labor Party does get it. Okay? So you're sending a signal, okay, and that's what I'm used to. I'd never voted in a British election before. Then this thing comes along and I've got the same mindset in the wrong political system. And, the British political system is a joke. It's a real farce. Have you ever seen the Monty Python special, the election night special?
No.
Watch it, okay? It literally just, they have the party, but it's a contest between the sensible party and the silly party, okay? That's the way they describe it. And it is actually an effective description of how the British system works. It's a farce. When anybody calls that a democracy is beyond me. But I was used to a more sensible system. I used a protest vote approach that makes sense in the sensible system, and the bloody referendum went through. So it was a disaster around, but that's one of the, I happily wear that as a mistake.
We should talk about Australian politics and Australian economy next time.
Yeah, it's another disaster.
Two final questions before we have some audience questions, if you like. You consider yourself or call yourself a post-Keynesian. What is a post-Keynesian economist?
It means somebody who regards the mainstream interpretation of Keynes as being wrong. So what's called Keynesian economics that's taught in the textbooks, and which people like Paul Krugman claims is a Keynesian these days, that was based on a neoclassical interpretation of Keynes. Okay, so
I learned at school when the economy is doing well, the government decreases spending.
Yeah.
And when when there's a recession or something and the economy is not doing well, then government is increasing spending.
Yeah.
Like anti-cyclical.
Yeah, and that's actually sensible in some ways. But that was described like this sort of supply and demand curve thing, but with a curve of the money which just went up exponentially at some point, and they supposedly divided the economy into where the classical theory made sense, which is where this is rising part of the curve, and where Keynes makes sense, where the curve is flat. And that's how, and that was interpreted by a guy called John Hicks. And Hicks later admitted that in fact it wasn't a model of Keynes, it was his own model that had not been effectively picked up in the literature, and he repackaged it as if it was an interpretation of Keynes. And he wrote an apology for it called ISLM, An Explanation, in 1981-82. So what was called Keynesian wasn't really Keynesian at all. There was a way of looking at Keynes, sort of covering some of the points Keynes makes, but resurrecting the supply and demand analysis. And that's what you got as Keynesian economics. So post-Keynesian say, look, that was a mistake. None of that makes sense. Keynes is about uncertainty, positive feedback systems, the dominance of investment under conditions of uncertainty, the importance of money, et cetera, all that was thrown out. So post-Keynesians have tried to be true to the critical side of Keynes, whereas the so-called Keynesians you get in textbooks were reintegrating Keynes with the neoclassicals. So it's actually what they call Keynesian macroeconomics was neoclassical macroeconomics.
Do post-Keynesians have an answer to climate change?
No, not really. I'm the leading, one of the leading people developing the post-Keynesian approach. We really didn't realize how bad the work of neoclassicals was until very late. So I've built some models of capitalism involving energy and breakdown and so on. So there are various attempts. Like one of my best friends in the area, a guy called Gaël Girard in France. He's done some work building post-Keynesian models of climate change, but they're incredibly simplistic. They're nowhere near as sophisticated and developed as they should be. And that's largely because we didn't realize how bad the work of neoclassicals was. Everybody assumed the neoclassicals got their results by having a very high discount rate. And I decided I was going to take a look at their literature. And I had friends saying, don't bother, Steve, you're just going to find it's the high discount rate stuff. And I wrote back saying, yeah, look, probably, but I want to know. And I read this stuff and I couldn't believe how bad it was, making up numbers about what climate change actually meant that showed they had no bloody understanding of it at all. So consequently, post-Keynesians have only really started developing alternative models in the last 7 years. And that's not enough. And we get lousy funding. We get nothing like the funding the neoclassicals do. So developing realistic post-Keynesian models hasn't really been done.
Well, maybe some people are watching this right now and want to join your cult.
Let's hope so.
A neoclassical economist, an autoliberal, like the German
version,
Austrian version, are they the same? Are they
the autoliberals sort
similar?
of the difference is the autoliberals are a bit more about the need for discipline. Very Germanic. Okay? So you've got to have rules and laws that impose controls to make sure you behave in a market-oriented way, whereas the Americans are basically, mad anarchists. They just let the market rip, no controls whatsoever.
Okay.
So there's more of a disciplinary side, and that's where the Maastricht Treaty rules come from. Let's make sure we can't end up as Keynesians by having rules about how much government debt there can be.
Steve, you definitely need to come back.
Yep, sure.
This was fun. You want to do some audience questions?
Yep, sure. Yeah.
somebody wants to know if you follow German politics and the discussion about the German debt limit.
They're crazy. The German debt limits just show an ignorance about the nature of government money creation. They should go. But you're stuck with them because you've made such a miasma out of the euro. There's no real way out. So it's a catastrophe. And the debt rules are stupid.
There's an interesting question from Senex. He says, what do you think about the old distinction between economy, oikonomia, and commerce, krematike, as given by Aristotle, for example?
The economy was actually, you go right back to the Greeks and see it was another way of describing the household and seeing the whole economy as a household. Mm-hmm. I think that's the wrong analogy. The economy is far more complex than a household. Yeah. And the commerce, so if you saw it specifically talking about commerce as an activity outside the household, then the commerce thing makes more sense.
What's the alternative to money and loans? Gold coins?
No. Understanding how money is created. I mean, there is an issue about money. Money is literally single-dimensional, okay? Mm-hmm. But we live in a multidimensional world, and we need some things to have a negative consequence for your creation of extra money. We need a multidimensional form of money. And I haven't worked it out what that is. But if you look at things like planetary boundaries, we don't want to be encouraging activities that breach planetary boundaries. Mm-hmm. So we need some way of attenuating the impact of money creation on the damage we're doing to the biosphere. We need, if we're going to have a functioning system, it'll have to involve money. But it has to be a form of money that doesn't lead to destroying the ecology. And we haven't worked that out yet.
What could be an effective way to overcome capitalism? Reformation or revolution?
I think it's going to be collapse. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I don't think capitalism is going to survive global warming. Okay. And we're much, much closer to catastrophe than people realise. The timing, quite a few climate scientists wonder whether we're going to make it to 2030 with a functioning civilization. Hopefully that's extreme. But some think we'll make it to 2050 and we'll have, get to net zero. But I've seen some colleagues of mine asked, if we continue on current trends, will we make it to 2100 as civilization? And I've seen people working in climate science say not a chance. If we keep this up, human civilization will collapse.
If you could change one thing in our modern age political constitutions, what would you change?
What I'd bring in is one thing I've worked out was this attempt to try to limit damage from global warming, and that's having a parallel currency involving carbon credits, where everybody would get exactly the same carbon allowance across a whole nation, equal to the average for the nation, and everything you bought would have a money price and a carbon price based on the carbon content of what you're buying. And if you give the average to everybody, then the poor, and I mean like the body 90 to 95% of the population, would never exhaust their carbon allowance. Whereas the rich, 5% and above.
That's communism, Steve.
No.
You can't have that.
The capitalists the rich would have to buy carbon credits off the poor.
Yeah.
Okay. And that would be a market mechanism, okay, where for the rich to continue consuming like they're doing, they'd have to pay the poor to buy the carbon credits the poor didn't use. And that would be far more effective than a carbon tax.
But don't we need them to stop consuming as much?
Yeah, as well.
If we allow them to...
This is before we start bringing in bans. There's no chance of bringing in bans until it becomes obvious that this is a life-threatening situation. So rationing didn't happen in the World War II until the British realised they were about to be defeated, and then they brought in rationing. Nobody would have accepted it beforehand.
Next question. There are many fundamental political shifts in Western politics. Are we currently witnessing the beginning of the end of the neoliberal era?
I think we are, but whether we ended up in fascism or a breakdown of the Mad Max societies, you'd like to end neoliberalism and go to a more realistic as well as a more ethical political system. But I think we're going to see the breakdown of neoliberalism and the collapse of capitalism.
another interesting question. To what extent could a global shrinking population in Asia, Europe, and America affect capitalism?
I think we need a shrinking population anyway. It's going to happen. Okay. The incredibly pessimistic estimates I know from some scientists about how much population is going to be left if we hit 4 degrees of warming, for example. That's less than 1 billion people. But yeah, we've got far too many humans, and there's far too much consumption of the planet, mainly of the wealthy ends of the spectrum.
Yep.
Okay. So we have to reduce population and
kill the rich.
Huh?
It's a joke. Adam Tooze was sitting on your table, on your chair, and he was like, kill the rich."
Well,
no. He was joking. He was joking, Rudi.
Yeah.
Any comment on Doyne Farmer's empirically supported thesis that climate neutrality is possible and profitable without large tweaks to our current economic system?
I think Doyne is an incredible optimist. I know Doyne. I like him and I like his research. But I think he's not aware of the scale of the issues in climate change, is underestimating how much change is necessary. We still get 85% of our energy from fossil fuels. And most of the other 15% is hydro and nuclear. It's not renewables, as people call them. And we don't necessarily have the minerals for the renewables either. There's all sorts of dilemmas we face there. So the idea that techno-optimism can get us there, we're starting from the wrong position.
I mean, technical innovation can also mean finding ways to use less energy for the...
That ultimately has to be the purpose, for using far less energy. And that means, for example, cars transport to go, but you've got to have a decent public transport system to compensate for it. And we're in a predicament now. We should never have got ourselves into this situation. But we've got trapped here because economists underestimated the damage from climate change. And now we're sitting on the very edge of where climate change is going to start destroying our productive capabilities. So there's no easy solution out of the situation we're in.
I think we kind of answered it already, but you can clarify. Can you ask him about his opinion on green growth?
That's impossible. Okay, it's an oxymoron. You can have green shrinkage, but we have to reduce the load we're putting on the planet. We're using, there's what's called the human ecological footprint. And on that basis, we're using virtually 2 planets a year in terms of the renewable capacity of the planet. We're well past what's feasible. We have to shrink. The question is shrink. We have two ways to shrink. Shrink chaotically and fall apart, or shrink with some degree of planning and minimise the damages and certainly limit the damage on those who are the poorest, who can't really cope with anything less.
But who do you want to sell shrinking to?
We're not going to sell it to anybody. It's going to happen. I can't see us making the right decisions. I can see us only being forced after we have a series of ecological catastrophes that even scare the complete climate deniers.
But these catastrophes are irreversible and make everything worse.
I know.
Jesus. Okay, final questions. What's your review or view of the Argentinian president Milei and his radical policies?
Well, he's a classic Austrian, and they don't understand money creation. Argentina is a basket case in so many ways. I had a meeting with the Argentinian embassy back in the 70s in Australia, and at that time the foreign debt of Argentina was roughly $40 billion US. And one of the diplomats said, we're almost certain you'd find $40 billion in the offshore accounts of wealthy Argentinians. And the level of inequality there is ridiculous. So in America, roughly speaking, 65% of consumption is work and consumption and 35% capitalist. In South America, 65% of consumption is capitalist and 35% worker. There's been a real emulation, the wealthy in South America trying to keep up with the wealthy in America. So the income inequality is so much greater. It's a basket. I wouldn't want the job of turning around the Argentinian economy, but I wouldn't be doing it the way Milei is either.
I read that your 3 favorite economists, that's my final question, then we're done. I read that your 3 favorite economists, all dead. They are Marx, number 1, Schumpeter, number 2, and Keynes, number 3.
More Minsky than Keynes.
Okay.
Keynes was still trying to get out of the Marshallian way of thinking, and he really didn't manage to escape completely. Minsky, I think, is the manifestation of Keynes with all that cleared up.
But who's your favorite economist who's still alive? Who should people be following? Or...
Well, I'm one of them, aren't I? It's a bit of a problem.
You can't name yourself, of course. You can't name yourself.
I'd probably say Mark Lavoie, my favorite post-Keynesian economist. But Mark,
never heard of him.
Okay, that's what I thought. But Mark doesn't push the envelope far enough and doesn't work in. Actually, funnily enough, my favorite economic modeler is a guy called Keynes.
Okay.
His first name is Tyrone, and he's discovered my Minsky software. Was running a cardboard box factory, okay, and now he's become the world's best Minsky modeler. So if you want to see what I think economic modeling should be, take a look at the work of Tyrone Keynes. You can find him on YouTube.
Well, people can find you on YouTube on our channel now.
Yeah,
and forever. Steve, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Australia and your software and all the questions that will come up in the comment section, I'm sure. Next time.
Let's do it. And I'll drink some scotch with a good friend in the meantime. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for watching, and see you next time, and support this show. Bye-bye.
Cool.